It was early October of 2019 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the woods near Willow Creek, Montana. I was 29 at the time, working a desk job that sucked the life out of me every single day. I needed a break. I didn't want hotels, I didn't want crowds, and I sure didn't want my phone buzzing every 2 minutes. I just wanted silence, trees, fresh air, and maybe some time to think about where my life was even headed. I packed up my old Chevy Tahoe with everything I thought I'd need. A heavy-duty tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers full of food and water, a propane stove, a few knives, a first aid kit, a thick jacket, and some extra clothes. I also threw in a small hatchet, an old revolver I barely knew how to shoot, and a heavy-duty flashlight with 2 extra sets of batteries. Better safe than sorry. The drive from my place in Bozeman to Willow Creek took about an hour and a half. The highway was mostly empty. As I got closer to the trailhead, the paved road turned into dirt, and the dirt road turned into what was basically just 2 ruts winding through thick forest. I didn't see another car for miles. No houses, no cabins. Just endless trees, mountains, and sky. I finally reached a small clearing where the trail started. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already low. I parked, grabbed my backpack, locked the Tahoe, and started hiking. My plan was simple. Hike about 4 or 5 miles into the woods, find a nice spot near the creek, set up camp, spend 2 nights, and hike back. Easy. I'd done rougher camping trips in college, though never completely alone. The first hour of hiking was peaceful. The woods were beautiful, thick pines towering over me, golden leaves crunching underfoot, the soft gurgle of Willow Creek running parallel to the trail. The air smelled sharp and cold, like pine needles and wet earth. I felt good. I felt like I was finally doing something real. About 3 miles in, I found a spot that seemed perfect. There was a flat patch of ground near a bend in the creek, some large rocks nearby for sitting, and a wide view of the woods in every direction. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and heated up a can of stew. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the woods turned dark fast. I sat by the fire, eating and staring at the stars, feeling that rare kind of peace that only comes when you're far away from everything. The first night passed without much excitement. I slept in short stretches, waking up now and then to the sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, snapping branches, the distant cry of some animal. It was normal stuff. I wasn't scared. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up just as the sun was rising. I boiled some water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to hike a little further up the creek without my heavy pack, just carrying my knife and a bottle of water. I wandered maybe another mile upstream, taking pictures of weird rock formations and old trees. I even spotted a deer drinking from the water. Felt like everything I'd hoped for. But when I got back to my camp around noon, I noticed something weird. First, it was small. My tent flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it shut before I left. I double-checked things like that out of habit. Still, maybe I had been in a rush. Maybe I'd just been careless. Then I noticed my backpack was in a different spot. I had left it right beside my sleeping bag inside the tent. Now it was near the entrance. It was unzipped, but nothing seemed missing at first glance. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd bumped it when leaving earlier. Maybe I was overthinking. I spent the afternoon chopping some more wood, fishing a little, and just enjoying being away from it all. But even though I tried to shake the feeling, something gnawed at me. A little itch in the back of my mind that said something was just off. That night, as darkness swallowed the woods, the feeling got worse. I sat by the fire longer than usual, not wanting to go inside the tent. I kept scanning the woods around me, flashlight in hand, trying to spot. What, exactly? A bear? A cougar? Maybe just a nosy raccoon? I didn't know. When I finally forced myself into the tent around 10, I kept the flashlight close and the revolver even closer. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, seemed louder, closer. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me solid. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something human. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps, moving around my campsite. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. I reached for the revolver, clutching it with both hands even though I had barely ever fired the thing outside a range. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped. Dead silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I kept telling myself, maybe it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a large raccoon. Then I heard it. The sound of something brushing against the fabric of the tent. Fingertips dragging along the nylon wall. Slow, careful. I squeezed the revolver harder, waiting, not daring to make a sound. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. I waited another hour, maybe two, unable to sleep, too scared to even move. Eventually, the faint light of dawn began creeping through the trees. Only then did I finally unzip the tent and peek out. Nothing. The fire had burned down to ash. The woods were still and silent, just like before. But the footprints were real. I found them in the dirt. Large, booted prints, way bigger than my own size 10s. They circled my tent twice and disappeared into the trees. They didn't come from the trail. They came from the deeper woods. My hands were shaking as I packed up. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I shoved everything into my backpack, half ran back to the Tahoe, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. The trail felt longer than I remembered. Every broken branch, every shadow between the trees made my heart race. I kept imagining someone stepping out from behind a tree at any second. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked, my stomach dropped. The Tahoe was there, but something was wrong. Deep scratches raked across the driver's side door. Long, deliberate, almost like someone had taken a knife and dragged it across the metal again and again. On the windshield, under the wiper, was something even worse. A Polaroid photo. It showed my campsite, my tent, my fire pit, my backpack. The photo had been taken at night, from the edge of the woods. I didn't think. I just jumped into the Tahoe, locked the doors, and gunned it out of there, tires kicking up rocks and dirt. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting some truck or beat-up pickup to come roaring after me. I made it home safe. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains, and sat on the couch clutching the revolver for hours. Later, when my hands stopped shaking, I forced myself to look at the Polaroid again. There was something I hadn't noticed at first. In the bottom right corner of the photo, just barely visible in the shadows near the trees, was a figure. A man, standing perfectly still, facing the camera. He had been watching me the whole time. I didn't call the police. What could I even tell them? That I went camping where no one was supposed to be and someone stalked me? There was no real crime to report, nothing stolen, no physical attack. Just the chilling proof that someone out there knew where I had been, watched me, and wanted me to know it. I never went back to Willow Creek after that. I never even camped alone again. Something about that experience changed me. It broke something loose inside me. The belief that if I was smart and careful, nothing bad could happen. Now, every time I hear a branch snap at night, every time I see a shadow move just a little too strangely, I feel that cold knot of fear tighten in my gut. Because I know, in some deep part of me, that there are people out there who don't need a reason to hurt you. They don't need a motive. They don't need anything except the opportunity. And in the middle of the woods, miles from help, I had given them exactly that. I still remember the summer of 2017 like it happened yesterday. I was 29 back then, working a desk job in Portland, Oregon. Life had gotten way too repetitive. Wake up, commute through traffic, sit under fluorescent lights for 9 hours, come home exhausted, microwave some dinner, sleep, repeat. I felt like I was wasting away inside my own life. So when I finally got a week off, I decided I needed a real break. Not a vacation in a hotel somewhere, but something quieter, something where I could feel like a human being again. I decided to go camping alone. I'd done it before a few times when I was younger with friends, but never solo. It felt like the kind of challenge I needed, simple, straightforward, something that would make me feel real again. I chose a spot deep in the Mt. Hood National Forest. It was remote but legal to camp there, and not a lot of people went that far off the marked trails. I picked an area that was about a 6-mile hike from the nearest parking lot, close to a small creek where I could get water. No cell service, no cars, no noise. Just trees, dirt, and me. I spent 2 days getting ready. I made lists and checked everything twice. I packed a good tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, a filtration pump for water, bear spray, a good knife, a basic first aid kit, a small hatchet for firewood, and a few other essentials. I even bought a heavy-duty flashlight with spare batteries, because I wasn't going to rely on just my phone. I wasn't an expert woodsman or anything, but I knew enough to stay safe. On a bright Monday morning, I loaded everything into my old Subaru and drove out. It took about 2 hours to reach the trailhead. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 other cars, probably day hikers. The air smelled amazing, clean, with a hint of pine sap and damp earth. I tightened my boots, shouldered my heavy pack, and started walking. The trail was narrow and winding, heading uphill at a slow but steady pace. It was rough in some spots, overgrown in others, but manageable. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, I veered off the main trail and took a smaller path that barely looked used at all. That was where I wanted to be, away from the easy-to-reach places. I kept following the faint path, checking my map and compass every so often. Eventually, I found the spot I had marked, a little clearing beside the creek, surrounded by thick woods. It was beautiful. The sun was slanting down through the trees, the water made a soft rushing sound, and the ground was flat and covered in soft moss. I dropped my pack and stretched, feeling every muscle ache from the hike. Then I got to work, setting up my tent, arranging my supplies, gathering some firewood, digging a small fire pit. I knew there was a fire ban in effect during that time, so I wasn't planning on building a big blaze, just something small to cook with if needed. As evening rolled in, the temperature dropped. I bundled up in a fleece jacket and boiled some water for instant noodles. I sat on a fallen log and ate while watching the sky turn from gold to purple to black. It felt good to be out there, with no screens, no noise except for the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. When it got dark enough that I couldn't see without my flashlight, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and listened to the forest. It took a long time to fall asleep. Every crackle, every rustle in the brush made my ears perk up, but eventually I drifted off. The first night passed without anything unusual happening. I woke up to birds singing and a pale gray light filtering through the tent walls. I stretched, got up, made some instant coffee, and walked a little ways upstream to wash my face. The water was freezing cold, but it woke me up fast. I spent most of the day exploring the area, hiking through the woods, taking pictures, sitting by the creek with my feet in the water. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. Started small. Just after sunset, as I was sitting by the creek, I thought I heard something in the woods across the water. A snapping sound, like someone stepping on a branch. I froze and listened, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was probably a deer. There were plenty of them out here. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like a prickling at the back of my neck. I finished eating and cleaned up my camp carefully. I put all my food into a bear-proof canister and wedged it between 2 rocks a good distance from the tent. Then I climbed into the tent, zipped it shut, and tried to relax. The sounds of the forest were louder that night, maybe because I was more on edge. I lay there in the dark, staring at the fabric inches from my face, listening. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I wasn't sure what had woken me. I turned on my flashlight and shone it around the inside of the tent. Nothing. I listened. At first, I heard only the creek. Then, faintly, I heard something else. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps, slow, deliberate. I lay perfectly still. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the creek, moving toward my camp. The flashlight shook slightly in my hand. I waited, holding my breath. The footsteps got closer. Then they stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Slowly, I reached for the bear spray, keeping as quiet as I could. I lay there, gripping it, straining my ears. Nothing. Finally, after what must have been half an hour, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time, heading back toward the creek. Eventually, the sounds faded completely. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt near my camp. Not animal prints, boots. Someone had been there in the middle of the night. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just another hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe they saw my camp and didn't want to bother me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I had camped too far from the main trails. Whoever it was had to have deliberately come all the way out here. I considered packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself I'd stay alert. Maybe they were gone already. The third day was tense. I didn't wander far from camp. Every little sound put me on edge. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But I never saw anyone. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight and bear spray within easy reach. I must have drifted off sometime after 2 a.m. I woke up just before dawn. It was still mostly dark, but there was a faint lightening of the sky. I felt cold, and my mouth was dry. Then I noticed the tent zipper. It was partly open, just a few inches, but it hadn't been like that when I fell asleep. I was sure of it. I sat up slowly, listening. The forest was silent. No wind, no birds yet. I crawled carefully out of the sleeping bag, grabbed the flashlight and bear spray, and slowly unzipped the tent the rest of the way. The camp looked normal at first glance. My gear was where I had left it. The fire pit was cold. The food canister was still wedged between the rocks. But there, in the soft earth just outside the tent, were more boot prints. Fresh ones. Someone had come right up to my tent while I was sleeping. I packed up as fast as I could. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move faster. I shoved everything into my pack, barely bothering to organize it. I skipped breakfast, skipped coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back was brutal. My pack was heavier than before, probably because I had packed it so badly. My legs ached, and my shoulders burned. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. Several times, I thought I heard something moving in the woods parallel to the trail. A faint rustling, a crack of a branch. But every time I stopped and looked, I saw nothing. The forest was too dense. Too many places for someone to hide. At one point, about 2 hours into the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. A scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. It looked like part of a sleeve, dark blue, ripped and dirty. It wasn't mine. I kept moving, heart hammering. I didn't stop until I saw the parking lot. My car was still there, sitting under the midday sun. Relief washed over me so hard I almost cried. I threw my pack into the back seat, locked the doors as soon as I got inside, and drove away without looking back. I didn't feel completely safe until I was back in the city, surrounded by people, concrete, and noise. I never reported it. What could I even say? Someone walked around my camp at night? There was no proof of anything illegal. No proof of anything at all, really. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. Someone was out there, far off the beaten path, away from the eyes of rangers and tourists. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who walked right up to my tent in the middle of the night and unzipped it. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were trying to scare me. Maybe it could have been worse. I don't let myself think too hard about what could have happened if I had woken up a little later, or if I hadn't noticed the open zipper, or if I had stayed another night. I haven't been camping alone since, and I had been waiting for a real break from work for months. In the spring of 2023, I finally decided to take a solo camping trip. I was 27 at the time, living in a small town in northern Idaho. The stress from my job, along with the endless noise of town life, had piled up on me. I just needed silence, fresh air, and a few nights under the stars. I picked a remote spot called River Bend Campsite, hidden deep inside Clearwater National Forest. It wasn't a popular place. In fact, when I searched for it online, there were barely any reviews. That was what attracted me. I didn't want kids running around or groups blasting music. I wanted peace. I packed my old green backpack carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, water filter, canned food, a good flashlight, 2 knives, one for cooking, one for protection, and a loaded first aid kit. I even packed a thick journal to write in. I wasn't planning to be back for at least 4 nights. I left early on a Thursday morning around 5:30. I remember the mist was still floating over the roads as I drove. It took me almost 5 hours to get close. The last part of the drive was on a rough dirt road that twisted and climbed up and down hills. I had to go slow, my old truck bouncing and shaking over every pothole. After a while, even the dirt road ended. From there, I had to hike about 4 miles into the woods to reach the camping spot. The trail was narrow, overgrown in some parts, and damp from rain a few days before. My boots got muddy quick. Every step I took, my backpack seemed to get heavier. I passed a few old signs pointing toward River Bend, all cracked and faded, barely hanging on to their posts. It was obvious that not many people came out this far anymore. Around noon, I finally reached the campsite. It was beautiful. The river curved in a soft U-shape, slow and steady, with smooth stones lining the banks. Huge pine trees stood around like guards. The forest stretched in every direction, thick and endless. The only sound was the soft rush of the river and birds calling overhead. No cars, no people, just nature. I picked a spot close to the water, but not too close. I didn't want to risk flooding if it rained again. The ground was mostly flat with a little grassy patch where I set up my tent. It took about an hour to get everything arranged the way I liked it. Fire pit set up, food hung up in a tree away from camp, and my backpack tucked safely inside the tent. I had brought an old foldable chair and set it facing the river. The first evening was perfect. I heated up some canned chili on the stove and watched the sky turn gold and purple. The river caught the colors, and everything felt heavy and still, like time itself had stopped. I stayed outside until the stars came out. Without city lights, the sky was unbelievable, thick with stars, like salt poured on black velvet. I stayed up later than I should have, just staring at it. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt truly at peace for the first time in years. I fell asleep quickly, listening to the soft sound of the river. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up with the morning sun leaking through the tent walls. My body was stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, but I didn't care. I spent the morning gathering dry wood for a proper fire and exploring a little up and down the river. I didn't go too far from camp though. It's easy to get lost out there, and I didn't have any signal on my phone. By the afternoon, clouds started to gather. I wasn't worried though. I had checked the forecast before leaving. It said just light showers, nothing major. I set up a tarp over the tent just in case. By evening, it started drizzling soft and steady. I sat under the tarp, reading an old paperback novel by flashlight, listening to the rain tapping above me. That second night, things started to feel off. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up, needing to pee. I sat up in my sleeping bag, groggy. The tent was dark, except for the faint glow of the river beyond the fabric. I pulled on my boots, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. Everything was wet and shining under the moonlight. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I wandered a few steps away toward a cluster of bushes and took care of business. As I was finishing up, I noticed something strange. The forest was too quiet. Normally you hear bugs, frogs, the occasional owl at night. But now there was nothing. Not even the river seemed loud enough. That's when I heard it. A crack, like a stick snapping underfoot. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I strained to listen. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. That's what I told myself. But then I heard another sound. A soft shuffle, like someone dragging a foot slowly across wet leaves. I backed slowly toward my tent, trying not to make a sound. I didn't have my knife on me. It was inside, zipped up safe and useless in the tent. Another crack, closer now. I ducked inside the tent, zipped it up halfway, and grabbed my bigger knife. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing, knife in hand, ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed, then more minutes. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, my muscles started to ache from sitting so tense. After maybe an hour, I finally let myself lay back down, knife still clutched in my hand. Morning came gray and heavy. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. When I stepped outside, the forest looked normal again. Birds were singing. The river was humming along. Everything looked harmless, but my gut still twisted uneasily. I checked around camp. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. I told myself I must have imagined it. Sleep deprivation, nerves, leftover city paranoia. I forced myself to go about my day normally. I boiled water for coffee. I went fishing downstream with the little rod I had brought. I even caught 2 small trout. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the forest looked empty. But a part of me was sure someone or something was just out of sight. That night, I built a big fire, bigger than necessary. I cooked the fish and sat close to the flames, comforted by the heat and light. The woods beyond the fire line were pure black. I stayed up late, way later than the nights before. I didn't want to sleep. Not really. But eventually, my body gave up. I crawled inside the tent around 2 in the morning, knife tucked inside my sleeping bag. It wasn't long before I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling. You know how sometimes your brain wakes you up because something isn't right? That's what happened. My eyes snapped open in the dark. The tent was lit faintly by the dying fire outside, and I saw it. A shadow, not moving, standing, right at the edge of the tent, just behind the thin fabric. Someone was standing there. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't move. I just stared, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadow didn't move either. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I gripped my knife so tight my hand ached. Minutes dragged by like hours. Finally, the shadow shifted. It stepped backward, slowly, and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting for it to come back. Didn't. To first light, I broke camp. I didn't even bother making coffee or packing carefully. I shoved everything into my backpack haphazardly, yanked the stakes out of the ground, and started hiking out as fast as I could. The trail back felt different. Every snap of a branch made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop to eat. I just kept moving. About halfway back, I noticed something else that made my stomach turn. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones. Bigger than mine. Leading down the trail behind me. Someone had been following me. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. Faster now. Almost running. It took me half the time to get back to my truck compared to the hike in. When I finally saw it sitting there through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I threw my backpack into the bed and jumped into the driver's seat. The key turned, engine roared to life, and I tore out of there, tires spitting dirt. Even once I got back to paved roads, I didn't feel safe. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights following me. I didn't. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window. I took the longest, hottest shower of my life, scrubbing away the fear. Then I collapsed into bed, every muscle in my body screaming. I thought a lot about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone stood outside my tent? They followed me through the woods? There wasn't much they could do. I didn't have any real proof. No photos, no evidence. Just my story. In the end, I never went back to River Bend. I never even went camping alone again after that. Whoever was out. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for months. After working long hours at a furniture warehouse in Birmingham, Alabama, my body was tired and my mind was burnt out. I needed to get away from everything. Phones, computers, noisy streets. I needed quiet. I needed space. I picked a small, lesser-known place called Hollow Creek Reserve. It was about a 2-hour drive from where I lived. I had found it while browsing some hiking forums. People said it was peaceful, untouched, and rarely crowded. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed light. A 2-person tent, a sleeping bag, my old backpack, a few cans of food, a hunting knife, and a basic first aid kit. I also brought a thick flashlight an extra set of batteries, and my steel water bottle. It was mid-September 2018. The weather had cooled down just enough to make camping comfortable. That Friday morning, I loaded my gear into my rusted-out Ford Explorer and started the drive. I had a printed map since the cell reception would be useless out there. I didn't tell many people about the trip, just my neighbor, in case something went wrong. The drive was quiet. The further I got from the city, the fewer cars I saw. By the time I reached the dirt road that led into Hollow Creek, it felt like I had the whole world to myself. Trees lined the road on both sides, so thick that the sunlight barely touched the ground. The dirt road was rough, and my tires kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the air behind me. After about 20 minutes down that road, I reached the small, beat-up parking area. It could probably fit 4 cars if they squeezed together. There was only one other vehicle there, a dark green pickup truck with no visible plates. I thought it was weird, but not too weird. Some people just take plates off old trucks when they're using them off-road. I parked at the far end, grabbed my backpack, and locked the doors even though I doubted anyone would come by. The trail into the woods was marked by a wooden sign that had seen better days. Most of the words were faded, but I could still make out Hollow Creek Loop, 7 miles. The air smelled fresh and clean. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. I started walking, feeling that familiar excitement in my chest that only came when I was far away from civilization. The trail was rougher than I expected. In some places, the path almost disappeared completely under fallen branches and overgrown brush. I took my time, making sure I didn't twist an ankle or trip over roots. About an hour into the hike, I found a spot that looked perfect for setting up camp. It was a little clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow creek running nearby. The water was clear and cold, perfect for refilling my bottle if I needed to. I set up my tent facing the creek and built a small fire ring with some stones I found scattered around. I gathered some dry wood and lit a small fire to cook a can of beans. As I ate, I leaned back against a tree and listened to the water trickling and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. The peacefulness settled into my bones. As the sun dipped below the trees, the forest changed. The cheerful chirps of daytime birds were replaced by the occasional call of an owl. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees creak and sway above me. I tossed some more wood onto the fire and watched the sparks float up into the darkening sky. I wasn't scared. I had camped alone before. The woods made noises that was normal. Twigs snapping, animals rustling around, the wind playing tricks on your ears. It was all part of being out here. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself into the sleeping bag, the fire was just glowing embers. The forest outside was pitch black, and the noises had settled into a steady rhythm. Frogs croaking, leaves rustling, distant branches cracking. I fell asleep easily, but something woke me up in the middle of the night. I opened my eyes to darkness. For a second, I didn't know what had woken me. I lay still, heart pounding, ears straining. There it was, a noise, not the normal rustling or creaking. This was different. It sounded like someone, or something, was moving around near my tent. My hand slowly reached for the hunting knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. My other hand grabbed the flashlight. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. The steps were soft, careful, not heavy like a bear or deer, lighter, slower, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The steps circled the tent once, then stopped. I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck. I clicked the flashlight on, but I didn't unzip the tent. I just pointed the beam toward the thin wall of fabric. It cast a faint glow outside, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The forest swallowed the light. Minutes passed. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, after what felt like hours, my body relaxed slightly. Maybe it had just been an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a coyote. Still, I didn't fall asleep again. I lay there, clutching the knife and flashlight until the first pale light of morning started to seep into the trees. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold. The clearing looked just as I had left it. I walked around the campsite carefully, looking for any signs of visitors. That's when I saw them, footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft dirt and dead leaves around my tent. They were human footprints, barefoot, no shoes, no socks, bare feet. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The prints came from the trees, circled my tent once, and then disappeared back into the forest. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I packed up quickly. I doused the fire with water, stuffed my gear into my backpack, and didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get back to the trail and out of those woods. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen, convinced I heard footsteps behind me. Sometimes I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing but trees. I forced myself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other. Don't panic, just walk. When I finally reached the parking area, my heart sank. The green pickup truck was still there, but now it was parked closer to my Explorer, almost blocking me in. It was angled weirdly, like whoever had parked it wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. I didn't see anyone around. The forest was dead quiet. I didn't waste time. I jogged to my car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and threw my backpack into the back seat. As I got in, I noticed something else. The truck's driver's side door was slightly open, just a crack, like someone had gotten out in a hurry or hadn't finished getting out yet. I didn't wait to find out. I started the engine and reversed out as best as I could without hitting the truck. My tires kicked up gravel and dust as I tore out of that parking lot and back down the dirt road. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me. But the road stayed empty. Once I hit the highway, I drove straight home without stopping. That night, I locked every door and window in my house. I pulled the curtains tight and kept the lights on. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house made me jump. I kept thinking about those barefoot prints circling my tent, the soft footsteps, the truck with no plates. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and told them what had happened. I didn't expect much. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but Hollow Creek was big, and finding one guy in miles of forest would be like finding a needle in a haystack. They said it was probably some drifter or local who liked messing with people. I didn't argue. I didn't care. I just wanted it out of my head. But it stayed with me. The thing that scared me the most wasn't that someone had been near my tent. It wasn't even the footprints. It was how careful they had been. No broken branches, no loud noises, no mistakes. Whoever it was, they knew how to move through the woods without being seen or heard. They knew how to stalk without getting caught. And they had gotten right up next to me. Since that trip, I've camped a few more times, but never alone. Never at Hollow Creek. And never again without letting someone know exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. I learned something important on that trip. The scariest thing out there isn't wild animals. It's not ghosts. It's people. People who know how to move quietly in the dark. It was late September when I decided to go camping. The weather had cooled down a bit, and I figured it was the perfect time to take a trip up into the mountains. I'd always enjoyed hiking, but camping was something I hadn't done in a while. My goal was simple: disconnect for a few days, get some fresh air, and just be alone for a while. Maybe it would give me time to think things through, clear my head. I didn't have a specific place in mind. I just knew I wanted to be far enough away from the city to escape the constant buzz of life. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and all the usual camping essentials. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, as I often did. I liked the solitude. I had been to the mountains a few times before, and I knew the area reasonably well, though I'd never been up to the remote trail I'd planned on taking this time. The drive up the winding roads was peaceful, almost meditative. The air was crisp, the kind that feels clean as you breathe it in, the smell of pine trees and earth filling my lungs. I passed a few small towns on the way, each one more deserted than the last. Finally, I reached the trailhead. It was just past noon, so the sun was still high, but there was a cool breeze that made everything feel a little more secluded. The parking lot had only a couple of cars. I could tell this wasn't a heavily trafficked area, which was exactly what I wanted. I loaded my backpack with water, snacks, a map, and the essentials for a couple of days out in the wilderness. It wasn't a long hike to the camping area, maybe 4 or 5 miles, but the trail was steep in some parts. The more I walked, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by the forest. The trees were dense, their trunks dark and weathered, the canopy above thick enough to block out much of the sunlight. The sound of the wind rustling through the branches was the only thing I could hear, and it made everything feel more isolated. By the time I reached the campsite, it was already mid-afternoon. The site was perfect. There was a clearing surrounded by tall trees, with just enough space to pitch my tent. A small stream ran nearby, its sound adding to the sense of peace that I was beginning to feel. The air was still, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some firewood, and started a fire. The crackling of the flames was comforting, like a signal that everything was going according to plan. I sat there for a while, enjoying the warmth, roasting a couple of sausages over the fire, and watching the sun slowly dip below the horizon. By the time night had fallen, the only light came from the campfire and the faint stars above. The temperature had dropped, and I could feel the chill in the air. I wrapped myself in a jacket, grateful for the warmth of the fire. The evening passed slowly, and eventually, I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest seemed distant now, almost muffled. I thought I would fall asleep quickly, but the silence, while peaceful, had a way of making me feel alert. I kept hearing things, small branches snapping, leaves rustling, something in the distance. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind. But in the quiet, my mind began to race. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a sudden thing. I had just drifted out of sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening. There was a sound coming from outside, not the usual rustling of the forest, but something else. A distinct, steady noise, like something large was moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself it was just a deer or a bear passing through. After all, I had camped in places like this before, and animals were just part of the experience. But the sound didn't fade. It didn't feel right. It was slow, deliberate, and it circled the camp. My heart started to race. I sat up in the darkness of the tent, straining my ears. The noise continued, and it was getting closer. Whatever it was big. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and turned it on, aiming the beam through the thin walls of the tent. For a moment, I saw nothing but the shadows of the trees outside. But the sound continued, and now I could hear something crunching on the ground, like it was standing nearby. I held my breath. It had to be an animal, right? Probably a bear. I knew bears were common in the area, but it didn't feel like any bear I'd encountered before. I'd heard bears rummaging through campsites before, but this was different. It was too calculated, too focused. I stayed frozen, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the sound to either leave or come closer. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was over. Maybe it was just a deer or something. I thought, couldn't be anything worse. With a sigh, I laid back down, trying to calm my racing heart. The noise had stopped, and the camp was peaceful again. The silence felt like a return to normalcy, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept hearing small noises, the sound of leaves shifting, the crack of a branch breaking. But every time I would open my eyes and listen, everything would fall silent again. The tension in the air was palpable. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the forest being the forest. I stayed awake for hours, just listening, watching the faint glow of the dying embers from the fire. It wasn't until just before dawn that I finally drifted off to sleep. I didn't sleep long, maybe an hour, maybe 2. The sound of something moving near my tent woke me again. This time, it wasn't the subtle rustle of the forest. It was something heavier, something big moving. I sat up again, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. This wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. Whatever it was circling my camp again. I couldn't make out the exact sound, but I could tell it was close. I grabbed my flashlight again, this time ready to shine it out into the night. As I unzipped the tent flap, I felt a cold gust of wind, a breeze that felt different, like it was moving in from the direction of the sound. I shone the light in that direction, my breath catching in my throat. The beam of light caught on something in the distance, something tall and dark standing among the trees. I blinked, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't an animal and it wasn't a person. It was something else, something tall and thin, almost like a shadow, but too solid to be just a trick of the light. My heart hammered in my chest. What was it? Who was it? Panic set in. I couldn't just sit here anymore. I needed to get out. I didn't know what this was, but I knew I wasn't staying to find out. I grabbed my things, what I could carry, and without thinking about it too much, I bolted from the tent. I didn't stop to pack anything else. I didn't care about the fire or the food I had left behind. I ran. I ran fast, straight down the trail I had come up on. The forest seemed endless as I sprinted through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure how long I ran, but it felt like hours. Eventually, I came to a point where the trees thinned out and I could see the trailhead again in the distance. The parking lot was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. But I didn't stop. I kept moving, not looking back, not even taking a moment to breathe. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors behind me and drove away, never once slowing down until I was miles down the road. I didn't stop until I was back in the nearest town, where I found a small diner to sit and gather my thoughts. I never went back to that spot in the mountains. Some things, I guess, are just better left unexplained. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe I had stumbled into something I wasn't meant to understand. But what I do know is that whatever was out there, circling my camp, was something I never wanted to encounter again. I never told anyone what happened. They would never believe me anyway, but I'll always remember that night. The silence, the movement in the dark, and the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, I still hear that rustling sound in my mind, and it's enough to make me never want to camp alone in the wilderness again. It was the summer of 2022 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the dense forests of northern Vermont. I had been hiking and camping for years, and although it was always something I enjoyed, I felt like I needed a break from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The stress from work had been eating away at me for months, and I thought some time alone in nature would do wonders. So, I packed my gear, set out on the road, and headed for a remote campsite I'd found while researching online. The drive was long but peaceful. The sun was high, and the trees on either side of the winding road seemed to stretch endlessly. I passed small towns and fields, the green hills rolling in the distance. When I finally reached the trailhead, I pulled over, grabbed my backpack, and locked my car. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh mountain air that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. The trail I was taking wasn't anything too challenging. It was well marked, a good 8-mile hike before reaching the site I had chosen. I had heard the area was quiet. Not many people camped up here. That was exactly what I was looking for: peace and solitude. The woods were thick with towering trees, their leaves whispering in the wind. I could hear birds calling and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I started walking, the weight of my backpack settling comfortably on my shoulders. As the miles passed, the trail became narrower and the forest grew denser. The trees were so tall, they almost blocked out the sun, casting long shadows on the ground. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. There were no voices, no sounds of civilization, just the hum of nature, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and the occasional distant call of a bird. After a few hours, I reached the campsite. It was situated by a small stream, the water clear and cool. The site was perfect, isolated with a wide clearing for my tent and just the right amount of space to set up a campfire. I was tired but content. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent, and gathered some firewood. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting an orange glow across the sky. I started the fire, the crackling flames breaking the silence of the forest. As the evening wore on, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest changed. The birds stopped singing, and the wind began to pick up. The trees swayed gently, their branches creaking. The crackling of the fire seemed louder now, almost deafening in the silence that surrounded me. It wasn't uncomfortable, just a little unsettling. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and ate quickly. The solitude was peaceful, but as the night deepened, I began to feel a strange sense of unease creeping over me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but something about the silence felt off. The forest, which had been so calm earlier, now seemed almost too quiet. No rustling of animals, no chirping of crickets, nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the isolation was getting to me. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I told myself that I had been out here alone plenty of times before and never felt this way. Still, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. I decided to turn in for the night. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Every little sound outside made me jump. A branch snapping in the distance, the flutter of a bird's wings, the wind moving through the trees. Each noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. My thoughts kept drifting to the silence outside. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was a feeling, a presence. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. There was someone moving outside my tent. The crunch of leaves underfoot. Slow, deliberate steps. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. I listened intently, trying to steady my breathing. The steps stopped. There was a long pause, and then nothing. Complete silence again. I waited, frozen, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Person? Couldn't tell. The thought of another human being out here sent a chill through me. I had seen no one on the trail earlier in the day, and this site was far off the beaten path. The chances of anyone else being here were slim, and yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. My instincts told me to stay silent, not to make a sound. I lay back down slowly, holding my breath. The night dragged on, and eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep. But I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every time the wind picked up or a twig snapped in the distance. Every sound seemed like it was coming from just outside my tent. At one point, I heard a low whistle, almost like someone trying to get my attention. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. By morning, I was exhausted. I had hardly slept at all, but I needed to pack up and move on. I couldn't stay there another night. The thought of staying another minute was unbearable. I packed my tent quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved my gear into my bag. The forest around me felt eerily still, like it was holding its breath. I made my way back down the trail, eager to leave that campsite behind. The further I walked, the more I felt like I could breathe again. The tension in my chest began to loosen. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, but as I made my way back to the trailhead, I tried to push it out of my mind. Could have been an animal, or maybe my mind just playing tricks on me in the isolation. When I finally reached my car, I felt a rush of relief. I opened the door, tossed my pack in, and drove away, not looking back. The forest, the campsite, all of it faded behind me as I sped down the road. I felt safe again, but deep down, I knew I would never forget that night. The silence, the footsteps, the sense of being watched. It was something that would stay with me for a long time. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I found out there had been reports of strange activity in that area. Not of ghosts or anything supernatural, but of campers and hikers feeling like they were being watched, like they weren't alone, even when no one else was around. Some even mentioned hearing footsteps, or seeing shadows out of the corner of their eyes, only to find nothing when they looked directly. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm sure of one thing. Something was out there, and I don't ever want to go back to that forest again. I'll stick to well-traveled trails from now on, where I know I'm not alone. It was the summer of 2022 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I had been working a desk job in Zurich for the past 3 years without much time off, and the endless routine had worn me down. I grew up hiking and camping in Vermont, and I missed being out in the wild, away from cities and screens. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you can only find miles away from any road. After some research, I picked a lesser-known trail in the Jura Mountains on the French-Swiss border. It wasn't a tourist hotspot, and that's exactly what I wanted. I packed my old gear, a weathered canvas tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, a water filter, and a sturdy backpack filled with simple meals. I bought a few new things too: a better flashlight, a stronger knife, and a solar charger for emergencies. I drove out early on a Thursday morning, hoping to avoid anyone who might be planning a weekend hike. The last village before the trailhead was small, maybe 20 houses scattered around a tiny church and a bakery. After stocking up on a few fresh rolls and some cheese, I parked my car near the trail entrance, double-checked the locks, threw my backpack on, and started walking. The trail started through a dense forest, the trees packed so tightly that even in the morning, the light barely touched the forest floor. It was exactly what I needed. The heavy scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. My boots crunched softly on the old, dry leaves, and every now and then I'd hear a squirrel darting through the undergrowth or the faint flap of a bird high above. By midday, I had covered about 10 kilometers. I found a nice clearing slightly uphill, far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be bothered by any other hikers, if there even were any. I set up my tent, boiled some water for tea, and lay back against a fallen log. The sky above was a clean blue, the kind you almost forget exists when you spend too much time indoors. The afternoon passed quietly. I jotted down a few thoughts in my small notebook, made a simple dinner of instant rice and tuna, and listened to the sounds of the forest deepening into evening. The breeze picked up, carrying the fresh, sharp smell of pine. As the sky shifted from deep blue to inky black, I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, feeling more at peace than I had in months. The first night passed without anything unusual. The next morning, I felt ambitious and decided to do some off-trail exploring. I packed a day bag, water, some snacks, a map, and my compass. I made sure to mark my camp clearly on my GPS just in case, then headed deeper into the woods. I moved slowly, taking time to notice everything. The way the ground sloped slightly downhill, the thick carpet of moss in certain patches, the broken branches that hinted at deer paths. About an hour in, I stumbled across what looked like an old fire pit, just a rough circle of blackened stones hidden by ferns. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while. That wasn't surprising. People sometimes came out here to camp illegally. Still, something about it felt odd. The stones were big, too big for just a casual fire, and scattered around it were small scraps of metal, rusty old nails, some bent wires. Maybe someone had tried to build a shelter here long ago. I didn't think much of it at the time. I took a few photos with my phone, then pushed farther into the woods. By late afternoon, I decided to turn back. I followed my compass north, but after a while, the ground started to look unfamiliar. There were no broken branches where I thought I had passed earlier, and the large mossy rock I had used as a landmark was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't panicked yet. I had my GPS, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dark. I hit the power button, but nothing happened. It was dead. I must have left it on earlier and drained the battery without realizing it. I had the solar charger, but with the sun already low behind the trees, it wouldn't help me now. I stood there, turning slowly, listening. The forest felt different, heavier. I forced myself to stay calm and headed north as best as I could guess, using the sun's position. The light faded faster than I expected, and soon I was stumbling through the trees, my flashlight flickering weakly ahead. I finally found my tent just as darkness fully set in. Relief washed over me so strongly that I nearly dropped to my knees. I crawled inside, zipped the flap tight, and stayed awake long into the night, listening. The forest wasn't quiet. Branches cracked in the distance. Not the quick, light sound of small animals, but heavier, slower breaks, like something large was moving carefully through the trees. I told myself it was deer, maybe a boar, but the sound didn't fade away as normal animals would. It circled, slow and deliberate, staying just out of sight. I clutched my knife tightly inside my sleeping bag and kept the flashlight pointed at the tent flap. Sometime after midnight, the sounds stopped. The next morning, everything looked normal. Sunlight dappled through the trees. Birds chirped. If not for the tension still coiled tight in my chest, I would have believed I imagined it all. I decided not to push my luck. I packed up quickly, shoving everything haphazardly into my bag, and started back toward the car. The first few kilometers were fine, but then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Every now and then, along the trail, I'd see fresh marks in the dirt, footprints, but not from hiking boots. They were barefoot. The prints were wide, deep, and human-looking. But who the hell would be walking out here barefoot? They weren't old either. The edges were crisp, not softened by time or rain. I picked up my pace. The farther I went, the more prints I saw, sometimes leading parallel to the trail, sometimes crossing it. Once, I found a small pile of rocks stacked neatly in the middle of the path, 5 stones balanced carefully on top of each other. I veered off the trail a bit to skirt around it. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want anything to do with it. The prints continued. At one point, I thought I heard breathing low, slow, somewhere off to my left. But when I swung my flashlight that way, there was nothing but trees. I finally spotted the small sign marking the start of the trailhead. Relief surged again, just a little farther. But as I approached the parking area, my steps slowed. Something was wrong. My car was there, but it looked different. The driver's side mirror was hanging loose, swinging gently in the breeze. Deep scratches ran along the side doors, long and jagged, as if someone had dragged something sharp along them. I jogged the last stretch, scanning the woods around me, heart hammering. I unlocked the door, threw my bag in the back seat without care, and jumped inside, locking the doors immediately. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands tight on the steering wheel, listening to the wind moving through the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't feel alone either. I started the engine. Thankfully, it still worked. I backed out carefully, tires crunching over gravel, and didn't stop driving until I was well down the winding mountain road, leaving the forest far behind me. Only once I reached the main highway did I allow myself to relax a little. The tension started to bleed away, replaced by sheer exhaustion. Later, back at home, I examined my car in the daylight. The scratches were worse than I thought. Deep gouges running from the front fender all the way to the rear. Whatever had done it had pressed hard. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone followed me barefoot through the woods and scratched up my car? Took weeks for the constant feeling of being watched to fade. Even now, nearly a year later, when I go for a hike, I find myself glancing over my shoulder more than I used to. I learned something out there in the Jura Mountains. Sometimes it's not the animals you need to be afraid of. Sometimes it's the people. My name's Ryan Matthews. I'm 27 years old, and the story I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, in 2022. At the time, I was living in Bozeman, Montana. I had always been a big fan of hiking and camping alone. Something about the quiet of the woods, the smell of pine, the way the cold bit at your fingers early in the morning. It made me feel alive. I worked a boring office job back then, and after months of sitting in front of a screen from 9 to 5, I decided I needed to get out. I had a long weekend coming up, and I planned a solo camping trip to a place I had read about online, Heartwood Forest, about a 2-hour drive northwest from town. It wasn't a super popular place, which was perfect. I hated busy campgrounds. I wanted to be alone in the real woods, not hear some family playing music from a Bluetooth speaker half a mile away. I packed up on Thursday evening my tent, sleeping bag, a hatchet, small camp stove, freeze-dried food, a first aid kit, bear spray, and my 9mm pistol. I was cautious, always had been. I checked the weather, clear skies all weekend. I even printed out a map of the area, highlighting a couple of good camping spots near a small stream that fed into Silver Lake. Cell service would be spotty or non-existent, but I wasn't worried. I'd be fine. I set out Friday morning around 6. The roads were clear, the sun rising slowly behind me as I drove through miles of open land, golden fields waving in the breeze. It was one of those crisp fall days, just cold enough to see your breath if you stood still. The kind of day that made you feel like the world was endless. By 8:30, I pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt track that twisted its way into the woods. The trees thickened fast, towering pines mixed with skinny white aspens. The dirt road went on for a while, growing rougher the deeper I went. I bounced along slowly, trying not to bottom out my old Tacoma. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached a clearing. It wasn't anything special, just a patch of ground where the trees thinned out enough to pitch a tent. It was perfect. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a minute, listening. Nothing but wind moving through the trees. No cars, no voices, no planes. Just silence. I got out, stretched my legs, and walked around a bit. The stream I had seen on the map was about 50 yards to the west. It wasn't much, just a ribbon of clear water slipping between rocks. But it was enough for cooking and cleaning. I spent the next hour setting up camp. I pitched my small green tent, set up the little stove on a flat rock, and gathered some dry wood for a campfire later. I knew I wouldn't need a fire. I had a stove, but it felt wrong to camp without one. Once everything was ready, I decided to do a little hiking. I left most of my gear behind but took the bear spray and pistol just in case. I followed the stream south, moving slow, enjoying the quiet. The woods were dense, but not oppressively so. Sunlight filtered through the trees in pale gold beams. Leaves crunched under my boots. Every so often, a squirrel would chatter at me or a bird would flutter out of a bush. It was peaceful. After a couple of hours, I looped back toward camp. I wasn't following a trail, just going by memory and the position of the sun. When I finally caught sight of my green tent through the trees, I felt a strange wave of relief. But as I stepped into the clearing, something made me stop cold. My tent was sagging. Not collapsed, but definitely messed with. The stakes on one side had been pulled out of the ground. The fabric was crumpled. My first thought was a bear. They were common enough, even if I hadn't seen any signs yet. My heart was hammering as I scanned the ground for tracks. I didn't see any. No claw marks, no prints, no scat. I moved slowly to the tent, one hand hovering near the pistol on my belt. I checked the inside, nothing missing, nothing torn up. My food was still sealed in the bear canister I had tied high between two trees. It didn't make sense. I walked a slow circle around the clearing, looking for any sign of what had happened. Still nothing. The ground was covered in pine needles and fallen leaves, making it hard to spot tracks. But it was like nothing had been there. Maybe the wind? I told myself that, but deep down I didn't buy it. The stakes were yanked out, not pulled loose. I spent the rest of the afternoon sticking close to camp. I built a fire as the sun dipped lower, cooking a packet of rice and beans on the stove while the fire popped and crackled. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see something or someone watching me, but there was nothing, just the growing darkness and the endless forest. Night fell fast. The stars came out in full force, so clear it felt like you could reach out and scoop them from the sky. The firelight cast flickering shadows, making the trees seem to move and sway. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, listening. Nothing. Around 10, I doused the fire, locked my food back up in the bear canister, and climbed into the tent. I lay there for a while, sleeping bag zipped tight, pistol tucked into the side pocket of the tent within easy reach. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a sound. A soft, steady crunching of leaves. Footsteps. I froze, every muscle in my body tight. The sound was close, maybe 10 feet from the tent, moving slowly. Crunch, Crunch, crunch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I slid my hand toward the pistol, fingers wrapping around the grip. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. I lay there, straining my ears. Nothing, just silence. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I didn't dare check my watch. Finally, the crickets started up again. I realized they had gone dead silent when I heard the footsteps, and now they were back. I forced myself to breathe normally, telling myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer, probably a deer. I didn't sleep much after that. When morning finally came, the first thing I did was step outside, blinking in the pale gray light. The clearing looked normal, nothing out of place. I did a slow lap around the site anyway. That's when I found it, about 30 feet from the tent, half hidden under some low bushes. A footprint, not a bear, not a deer, a boot print, human. It wasn't mine. It was too big, too wide, and it was fresh. I could still see the sharp edges where the mud had been pushed down. My stomach twisted into a knot. Someone had been out there, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I packed up fast, barely even eating breakfast. I kept the pistol holstered but ready, every sense on high alert as I tore down the tent and jammed it into the truck bed. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the dirt track, bouncing toward the main road. Even then, I kept checking the mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see a figure step out of the trees. I made it home by noon, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I kept thinking about that footprint, about the slow, deliberate steps around my tent. Whoever it was, they hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't attacked me. They had just watched. That was the worst part. The next day, I told a buddy of mine, a local sheriff's deputy, about what happened. He listened, nodding slowly. When I showed him the map of where I had camped, he frowned. "That's near the old mines," he said. I didn't know what he meant, so he explained. Decades ago, the area had been mined for silver. When the mines dried up, a few workers had stayed behind, living off the land. Over the years, some weird folks moved in, squatters, hermits. Most were harmless. But now and then, hikers would report seeing strange people in the woods. Ragged, dirty, sometimes armed. "They don't like visitors much," he said. "You were smart to leave." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Since that trip, I haven't camped alone again. I still hike. I still love the outdoors. But I stick to marked trails now, to busy campgrounds where there are always other people around. I guess I learned something out there in Heartwood Forest. The woods are beautiful. They're peaceful. But they're not empty. And sometimes it's not the animals you need to worry about. It's the people. I was 26 years old the summer I decided to camp alone deep in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. I had been living in Boise for a couple of years, working a quiet job at a small graphic design firm. Life had been steady but boring, and I found myself craving something a little different. I hadn't done a lot of camping alone before, but I figured if I brought the right gear and kept my head straight, I could handle a few days in the wilderness. I had read plenty about the area, and it seemed safe enough, remote, beautiful, a good challenge. I planned the trip for late July, 2023. It would still be warm but not unbearably hot during the day, and the nights would be cool and quiet. I spent a couple of weeks getting ready. I bought a new tent, a better sleeping bag, a small camp stove, extra batteries, and a water filter. I mapped out a trail that would take me about 6 miles into the forest to a small lake called Pine Hollow Lake, tucked away from the more popular camping spots. The morning I left, I packed everything carefully into my old Toyota 4Runner. It was just getting light when I pulled out of the city, the streets still mostly empty. It felt good to leave it all behind for a few days. I drove for about 4 hours, stopping once at a little gas station in a town called Stanley to fill up the tank and grab a sandwich for later. After that, the road narrowed and twisted up into the mountains. Tall pines crowded the edges of the road, and the air smelled sharp and clean. I reached the trailhead around noon. There were no other cars there, which made me feel a little nervous but also excited. I checked my gear again, slung on my heavy pack, and started up the trail. The first mile was a steady climb, and I could feel the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. My boots crunched over dry pine needles and rocks. A few birds chirped somewhere out of sight, but otherwise it was quiet. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, taller. The sunlight came down in broken shafts through the branches, lighting up bits of the trail ahead. Every so often I would stop to drink water and adjust the straps on my pack. I passed a couple of streams, clear and cold, and refilled my water bottle. There were signs of wildlife everywhere. Tracks in the mud, claw marks on old tree trunks, but I didn't see anything larger than a squirrel. It took me about 3.5 hours to reach Pine Hollow Lake. When I finally pushed through the last stand of trees, the lake was there before me, still and deep blue, with steep hills rising on 3 sides. There wasn't a single sign of another human. No campfire rings, no trash, nothing. I felt like I had the whole world to myself. I picked a spot near the edge of the lake to set up my camp. The ground was mostly flat, and there was a big, sturdy pine tree that would give me some shelter. I unpacked my tent and set it up, driving the stakes deep into the ground. Then I spread out my sleeping bag inside and organized my gear. I made a little fire ring out of rocks, collected some dry wood, and got a small fire going. I cooked a quick dinner, just some instant noodles, and ate while watching the sunset bleed across the lake. By the time it got dark, the air had turned cold. I pulled on my jacket and hat and sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was so quiet compared to the city. Every little rustle in the trees seemed louder than it should have been. I tried not to spook myself, but after a while, the darkness pressed in too much and I decided to call it a night. I made sure the fire was out cold, double-checked the tent zippers, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The first night was restless. Every little sound woke me up. A twig snapping somewhere outside, the soft lapping of water against the shore, the wind stirring the trees. I kept telling myself it was normal, that this was just the way the forest sounded at night. But it was hard to convince my brain, wired for city noise, that I was safe. At one point, maybe around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something bigger moving through the brush nearby. I held my breath, listening hard, but it faded away after a few minutes. Probably a deer, I thought, maybe even a bear, but it didn't come close to my camp. The next morning, I woke early, stiff and sore from sleeping on the ground. I boiled water for coffee, ate some oatmeal, and spent a few hours exploring around the lake. I followed a game trail up one of the hills and found a rocky outcrop where I could see for miles in every direction. The forest stretched out like a green ocean, and the sky above was huge and cloudless. By afternoon, clouds started rolling in from the west, dark, heavy ones. I hadn't seen anything about rain in the forecast, but weather in the mountains could change fast. I made sure everything that needed to stay dry was packed into my tent and tightened down the guy lines in case of wind. Around dinner time, the first drops started to fall. Within an hour, it was pouring. I spent the evening huddled in my tent, reading a paperback book by headlamp and listening to the rain drum against the nylon. The temperature dropped, and the wind howled through the trees, but the tent held strong. Eventually, I fell asleep to the sound of the storm. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. It wasn't the rain that woke me. It had mostly stopped, but something else, a sound, a sharp, heavy cracking noise, like a branch snapping under weight. Then a deep thud, as if something large had hit the ground. I lay there, heart hammering, staring up into the darkness of the tent. I heard another noise closer this time, a steady, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps, heavy ones, slow, careful. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still. I reached out slowly and grabbed the handle of my camp knife, keeping it under the edge of my sleeping bag. I didn't move otherwise. I barely breathed. The footsteps circled the camp, crunching over dead leaves and twigs. They paused now and then as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening, too. I squeezed the knife harder, my palms slick with sweat. Minutes dragged by, 10, maybe 20. Eventually, the sounds moved off into the woods. I lay awake for the rest of the night, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. When daylight finally crept into the tent, I was exhausted but alive. I forced myself to get up and check around the camp. Everything looked normal at first. The firewood pile was still stacked neatly. My backpack was untouched. But over by the edge of the trees, about 30 feet away, I found something that made my stomach turn. Tracks. Big ones. Human-shaped, but wrong. Too wide, too deep, spaced far apart like whoever made them had a massive stride. They weren't bear tracks. I had seen bear tracks before, and these weren't it. They looked more like boots, but oversized, and there was something off about the shape. Like the heel was too long or the toe too narrow. I stared at them for a long time, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just that someone or something had been near my tent in the middle of the night. It was that they had been moving slowly, circling, almost stalking. I told myself it was probably just another camper, someone messing around. Maybe they had wandered too far from their own site and got curious. But deep down, I didn't believe it. No one camps this deep without a reason, and I hadn't seen a single person since I left the trailhead. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe I was just tired, on edge from the storm, from the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my knife close and set up a few noisy traps. Sticks balanced on rocks around my tent that would fall and make noise if anything moved nearby. The day passed quietly. I fished a little in the lake, caught a couple of small trout, and cooked them up for dinner. The sky stayed clear, the wind light. If it hadn't been for the tracks, I might have felt completely at peace. That night, I made sure everything was ready before I crawled into the tent. Knife beside me, headlamp within easy reach, backpack packed except for the sleeping bag, ready to grab in a hurry. I lay awake for hours listening. For a long time, there was nothing but the normal sounds, the water, the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. I started to think maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe whatever or whoever had been out there had moved on. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. A footstep, heavy, deliberate. Then another, closer. One of the stick traps snapped, a sharp clatter. I froze. Something brushed against the side of my tent, making the thin fabric tremble. My heart leapt into my throat. I stayed completely still, hand wrapped tight around the knife. The thing outside stood there for a long moment. Then I heard a low, scraping sound, like nails or claws, dragging lightly along the tent wall. I couldn't take it anymore. In one motion, I grabbed my headlamp, flicked it on, and slashed open the front of the tent with my knife. I burst out, shining the light wildly into the trees. Nothing, just empty forest, silent and still. I spun in a full circle, heart hammering so hard it hurt. And then, about 40 yards away at the edge of the trees, I saw something. A figure. I never thought camping alone would scare me. I grew up spending weekends hiking the forests around Vermont, fishing, building fires, and sleeping under the stars. After moving to Colorado in 2022 for work, I decided it was time to explore the wilderness again. I was 27 back then, working a remote job that let me take weekdays off. That's why one random Tuesday morning in late September, I packed my old Toyota Tacoma, threw in my tent, a cooler full of food, a sleeping bag, and some basic gear, and drove 4 hours out toward the Uncompahgre National Forest. The drive was peaceful. It was early fall, and the trees were just starting to change color. I rolled down the windows and let the cool mountain air fill the cab. I hadn't planned anything fancy, just a simple 2-night solo trip, something to get away from emails, deadlines, and my noisy apartment complex. I picked a spot that was off the grid, no campgrounds, just dispersed camping where you find a clearing and set up. When I finally pulled off the gravel road onto a narrow dirt path, it was about 3:30 p.m. I followed the path for maybe half a mile, bumping along slowly, until it opened into a small meadow surrounded by thick trees. It was perfect. I parked the truck at the edge, threw on my backpack, and started setting up my tent a little ways into the clearing. The ground was flat, covered in a soft layer of dry pine needles. By the time my small green tent was staked down, it was nearing 5 p.m. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows between the trees. I built a small fire pit using some stones I found nearby, gathered a pile of dry wood, and got a fire going. Dinner was just a simple sandwich and a cold bottle of water. After eating, I sat there for a while, staring at the flames, listening to the distant sounds of nature, the chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The first night passed uneventfully. I climbed into my sleeping bag around 9:30 p.m., tired from the drive. I slept surprisingly well, only waking a few times to shift position. At one point, maybe around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something walking through the brush near the tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. It wasn't loud, just a few slow steps, a crack of a twig, then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Colorado was full of wildlife. I didn't even unzip the tent to check. I just lay there, listening, heart beating a little faster than usual, until I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning was cold. I could see my breath when I stepped out of the tent. The fire had long since died down to cold ash. I made myself a cup of instant coffee with my little camp stove and sat quietly, warming my hands around the cup. I decided to take a hike deeper into the woods that day, maybe explore a little and see if there were any streams nearby. I grabbed my day pack, just water, a granola bar, a lighter, and a small first aid kit, and set off. I didn't bring my phone. I wanted to disconnect completely. At first, the hike was beautiful. The trees were dense but not impossible to move through. Every now and then I'd find a game trail and follow it. I kept track of my direction by paying attention to the sun's position. After maybe an hour of hiking, I came across something strange. In a shallow gully, partly hidden by brush, I found what looked like an old, rusted-out car. It must have been sitting there for decades. The paint was almost completely gone. The tires rotted away. Vines grew through the broken windows. I approached carefully, curiosity getting the better of me. The car was an old Ford pickup, probably from the 1970s. The doors hung open at odd angles. Inside, the seats were torn and full of debris. It smelled like damp earth and mold. What unsettled me wasn't the truck itself, but what was inside it. Stuff, a lot of it. Blankets, empty cans of food, torn clothes, even an old, torn sleeping bag wadded up in the back seat. It looked like someone had been living in it at some point. Not recently, the stuff was decayed and water damaged, but maybe a few years ago. I didn't stay long. The place gave me a bad feeling, like I was intruding. I turned and hiked back toward camp, moving a little quicker than before. When I got back to the clearing, everything looked normal at first. The tent still stood. The truck sat where I left it. But as I got closer, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The zipper on my tent door was about a third of the way down. I was sure I had zipped it fully closed when I left. I stood there, staring, feeling the first real chill of fear creep up my spine. I walked slowly up to the tent, looking around. No footprints that I could see, just my own stamped into the soft ground from before. I knelt down and peeked inside. Nothing looked disturbed. My sleeping bag was still neatly laid out. My backpack sat where I left it. It didn't look like anyone had gone through my stuff. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Maybe just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon trying to find food. I checked my cooler, still latched shut. Everything untouched. I even checked under the truck, nothing. I spent the rest of the afternoon sticking close to camp, gathering more wood, sharpening a stick into a makeshift spear. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because it made me feel a little better. As the sun started setting again, I rebuilt the fire and cooked a simple meal. Can chili heated over the flames. It was a little after 8 p.m. when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, definitely footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the treeline. I killed the fire quickly, letting darkness swallow the campsite. I crouched low, heart hammering in my chest, gripping the sharpened stick so hard my knuckles went white. I listened, barely breathing. The steps moved from left to right, circling. Then they stopped. I waited in silence for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the night noises returned. The crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. I didn't relight the fire. Instead, I sat there in the dark, eyes straining to see any movement. At some point, exhaustion won out. I crawled into the tent but didn't get inside the sleeping bag. I lay there, fully dressed, shoes on, stick within reach, listening. Every little sound made my nerves jump. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. When dawn finally crept over the trees, I got up stiffly, packed my gear as fast as I could, and decided to leave. I didn't even bother with breakfast. Something didn't feel right about that place, and I wasn't about to stay another night. When I opened the driver's door, my heart sank. Someone had messed with the truck. There were muddy handprints on the driver's window. Big ones, not animal prints, human hands smeared across the glass. The side mirror was bent at an odd angle, like someone had tried to rip it off. I checked the truck carefully. No slashed tires, thank God. No broken windows, just those handprints and the twisted mirror. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. The truck bounced hard over the dirt path, branches scraping the sides, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to a real road, to people, to somewhere safe. The drive back to town felt twice as long. Every car that passed made me flinch. Every glance in the rearview mirror made my heart race, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally rolled into a gas station on the outskirts of Montrose, I pulled into a spot under the bright lights and sat there for a while, hands gripping the wheel. I must have looked pretty rough because the clerk inside gave me a long, concerned look when I went in to buy coffee. I didn't report anything to the police. What would I have even said? Somebody might have been creeping around my campsite? It sounded stupid. No crime had actually happened. I told myself it was probably just some drifter, some hunter maybe, curious about a stranger camping alone. No harm done. Still, when I got back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling. For days, I kept thinking about the old truck abandoned out there, about the stuff inside it, about the footsteps around my camp, about the handprints. I haven't been camping alone since. It's not because I'm scared of the woods. I'm not. I'm scared of people, of what some desperate, broken person might do if they find you alone, far from help, deep in the middle of nowhere. Camping is supposed to be about peace, about connecting with nature. But out there, that night, it wasn't nature that made me feel unsafe. It was something far worse. It was the heavy, certain knowledge that I wasn't alone. And whoever was out there with me, they weren't looking for a friend. It was late September 2018 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I was 27 at the time, living in Eugene, Oregon, and had been working long hours at a shipping warehouse. The stress had been piling up, and I felt like I was on the edge of burning out. I needed a break from everything. The city noise, the crowds, my phone constantly buzzing. I picked a spot I had read about online, a place called Pine Hollow Forest, about 2 hours east of town. It wasn't a well-known place. Most people went to the bigger parks nearby, but Pine Hollow was quieter, less touristy. It seemed perfect for what I needed: peace, fresh air, and time to think. I spent a whole afternoon getting ready. I packed my old green tent, a thick sleeping bag, a small camping stove, a few cans of food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a hunting knife I always brought with me on trips. I also threw in a couple of books and my old journal. I didn't want to rush back, so I packed enough supplies to stay for 3 nights. I left early the next morning. It was still dark when I loaded my gear into the back of my dusty pickup truck. The drive was calm. I watched the sky slowly brighten as I moved away from the city, the streetlights disappearing behind me. After a while, the roads got narrower and rougher. I passed a few farms, a couple of small towns that looked half abandoned, and then nothing but thick forest. When I finally reached the dirt road that led into Pine Hollow, it was already mid-morning. The air was cool and smelled like wet pine. The road was rough, full of potholes, and branches scratched against the sides of my truck. I followed the winding road for about 3 miles before reaching a small clearing where I could park. There wasn't a soul around. No cars, no signs, just a simple wooden board with the faded words, Pine Hollow Public Land. I grabbed my backpack, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail wasn't well marked, but it was visible enough. A narrow path through thick woods. Felt good to be out there, alone. The sunlight filtered through the trees in patches, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of birds. I hiked for about an hour before finding a spot that looked right. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream, with a few flat areas perfect for setting up a tent. I dropped my pack and stretched my arms. It felt good to finally be away from everything. I spent the next couple of hours setting up camp. I pitched the tent carefully, making sure it was secure in case it rained or got windy. I gathered some stones and made a small fire ring. After everything was set up, I sat by the stream and ate a simple lunch, just a can of beans and some crackers. I felt calm for the first time in months. The rest of the day was uneventful. I explored a little around the clearing, making mental notes of the surroundings so I wouldn't get lost. I read for a while, wrote a few thoughts in my journal, and built a small fire when evening came. As night fell, the woods grew colder and darker. I threw a few more sticks into the fire and watched the sparks fly up into the black sky. I slept surprisingly well that night. The sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl were like a lullaby. The second day started out peaceful too. I decided to take a longer hike deeper into the woods. I packed a small bag with some water, a snack, my knife, and the flashlight just in case. I didn't plan to go too far, just far enough to really feel like I was in the middle of nowhere. The woods were beautiful. Tall pines, soft moss underfoot, the occasional flash of a squirrel or bird darting past. I even found an old deer trail that I followed for a while, thinking maybe I'd spot some wildlife. After a couple of hours, I sat down on a fallen log to rest and eat. That's when I noticed something strange. It was quiet, too quiet. At first, I thought maybe I had just gotten used to the sounds of the forest. But no, it was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing. Just a heavy, pressing silence. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. I decided it was time to head back to camp. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping an eye out for the familiar landmarks I had noted earlier. Took longer than I thought. The woods all started to look the same after a while, but eventually I found my way back to the clearing. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, hearing little snaps of branches that made my heart jump. But whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I kept the fire burning higher than usual that night. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. I could hear the stream, the occasional rustle of leaves. But there was something else. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I slowly sat up, careful not to make any noise. I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I waited, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I shone the flashlight out of the tent flap, sweeping it across the clearing. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited a few minutes, listening. Everything seemed normal again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal and lay back down. But it took a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I decided I would cut the trip short. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I felt exposed out there in the clearing. Just as I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet from where I had been sleeping, in the soft dirt near the stream, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled around my tent, leading into the trees. I froze. My mind raced. There was no way I could have made those. I had worn boots the whole time, and I hadn't been walking around barefoot. I hadn't seen anyone else out there. I hadn't even heard anyone approach. Whoever it was, they had come in the night silently. I finished packing as fast as I could. I didn't even bother to clean up properly. I just threw everything into my backpack and started back toward my truck. The walk back was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept expecting to see someone following me between the trees, but the woods stayed silent. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I nearly ran the last stretch. I threw my gear into the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath, hands gripping the wheel. As I was about to start the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the clearing. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. I didn't wait around to find out. I started the truck and drove down that rough dirt road faster than I should have. Branches scraping the sides, potholes making the whole truck shake. I didn't care. I just wanted out. It was only once I was back on the highway, with other cars around and the city lights in the distance, that I finally started to relax. I never found out who or what had been out there that night. I thought about reporting it to the park service, but what would I even say? Someone walked barefoot around my tent in the middle of the night? It sounded crazy even to me. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone again. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to well-traveled places now. Places where other people are nearby, where I can see lights in the distance, hear voices, know that if something happens, help isn't miles and miles away. That trip taught me something important. The real dangers out in the woods aren't bears or wolves or even getting lost. The scariest thing out there is other people. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 27 years old when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had just quit my boring desk job in Geneva and wanted a break before figuring out what to do next. I always loved being outdoors, and I figured a week alone in nature would help me clear my mind. I packed my old green backpack, loaded it with everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, a week's worth of dehydrated meals, water filters, a knife, some clothes, a flashlight, a power bank for emergencies, and a couple of paper maps. I decided to head to the Jura Mountains, close to the border of France. It wasn't a famous national park, and that was the point. I didn't want to deal with noisy tourists or packed campgrounds. I found a spot near a tiny village called Les Rouses. I had read online that the trails around there were beautiful but pretty isolated. Perfect. I rented a small car, drove for about 4 hours, and parked near a trailhead in a dirt lot. There were only 2 other cars when I got there. I started hiking mid-morning, the sun high and bright. The trail cut through thick pine forests, across open meadows, and over rocky hills. I didn't see another person the whole day, just the sound of birds and the occasional rabbit darting across the path. The air smelled fresh, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I hiked about 15 kilometers before finding a clearing next to a slow-moving stream. It was a perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my small one-person tent under a cluster of fir trees, filled my water bottles from the stream, cooked a quick dinner of instant noodles, and watched the sky turn a deep orange as the sun set. It got cold fast once the sun went down. I crawled into my sleeping bag, read a few pages of a paperback novel, then switched off my flashlight. The first night was fine. I woke up once to the sound of an owl hooting somewhere close but otherwise slept deeply. The second day, I explored farther up into the hills. I had packed light, so I left my main gear behind, carrying only water, some snacks, and a small first aid kit. I followed animal trails and climbed rocky ridges to get a better view of the landscape. It was endless green and gray, forest stretching as far as I could see, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop. I didn't have cell phone reception anymore, but that didn't worry me. I had paper maps and a compass. I knew which direction my campsite was. Still, I was careful to mark landmarks in my mind as I walked. A weirdly bent pine tree, a fallen log shaped like a Y, a smooth, flat rock the size of a small car. I spent most of the day wandering and returned to camp in the late afternoon. That evening, as I boiled water for dinner, I noticed something strange. About 20 meters away, just inside the tree line, there was a large pile of stones that hadn't been there before. It was maybe waist-high, round and neat, like someone had taken the time to stack them carefully. At first, I figured it was some kind of natural pile, maybe a small landslide I hadn't noticed. But the stones looked too clean, too organized. I walked over to it. Each stone was placed intentionally, almost like a cairn. There were no footprints around it, at least none that I could see in the soft mossy ground. It unsettled me a little, but I shook it off. Maybe some other hiker had passed by while I was out exploring. Maybe it had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. I finished eating, zipped myself into my tent, and tried not to think about it. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was a low, steady crunching sound, like heavy footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and close, maybe 10 or 15 meters away. I stayed perfectly still inside my sleeping bag, straining to hear more. The steps moved around the tent, then paused. I could feel someone or something standing just outside. The sides of my tent were thin, and the moon was bright enough that I could see a faint shadow move across the fabric. A tall figure, definitely human, standing there silently. I didn't move. I didn't even dare breathe loudly. I had my knife tucked next to me inside my sleeping bag, but I didn't want to reach for it and make a noise. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving away, slowly and steadily, until they faded into the woods. I lay there frozen for the rest of the night, barely sleeping, ears wide open for any other sounds. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground was disturbed. Dry leaves kicked aside in a rough circle around my campsite. No clear boot prints, but definitely signs of someone having walked around during the night. I packed up in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my stove when trying to cram it into my backpack. I told myself it could have been a local hunter, maybe a lost hiker, maybe even a forest ranger checking on things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Still, I wasn't ready to give up on the trip just yet. I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. I hiked farther into the forest, heading toward a small lake I had marked on my map, maybe 10 kilometers away. The trail got rougher, more overgrown, harder to follow. I liked it that way. It made me feel like I was really out in the wild. By mid-afternoon, I found the lake. It was a beautiful place, completely untouched. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom even several meters out. I found a small flat patch near the shore and set up camp again. I made a fire this time, gathering dry branches and sticks. I figured a fire would make me feel safer. Plus, it would keep animals away. As the sky darkened, I sat by the fire, roasting a packet of sausages I had packed. The woods around the lake were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects buzzing, just the sound of the fire crackling. When I finally crawled into my tent and turned off my flashlight, I lay awake for a long time, listening. The silence pressed against my ears. Every tiny noise, the settling of the tent fabric, the crack of a twig, made my heart jump. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy splashing into the water. I sat up quickly, heart pounding again. Another splash, smaller this time, like something or someone wading into the lake. I unzipped the tent quietly and peeked out. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the lake. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, near the far shore, I caught a glimpse of movement. A dark shape, waist deep in the water, moving slowly toward my side. It was too big to be an animal, way too big. It moved like a person, slow and steady, without hesitation. I backed into the tent and grabbed my knife. I sat there, holding it tight, every muscle in my body tense. The splashing stopped. I didn't know where the figure had gone. Maybe it had climbed out onto the shore. Maybe it was hiding in the trees now, watching me. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. I couldn't see anything beyond a few meters from the tent. I sat there until dawn, knife in hand, shaking, every noise outside making my heart slam against my ribs. When it finally got light enough to see, I stepped outside. There were wet footprints leading out of the lake, straight toward my camp. They stopped about 10 meters from my tent, just at the edge of where the dying firelight would have reached. Then they turned and headed back toward the woods. They weren't animal prints. They were human footprints, barefoot. At that point, I stopped pretending it was nothing. I packed my gear as fast as I could, barely bothering to roll up my tent properly. I stuffed everything into my pack, slung it onto my back, and started hiking back the way I had come. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every snapped twig, every gust of wind made me whip my head around, scanning the trees. I didn't stop to rest. I barely stopped to drink water. I just kept moving, heart hammering in my chest. By mid-afternoon, I reached the dirt road where my car was parked, or where it should have been parked. The car was gone. At first, I thought maybe I was on the wrong road, but no, the landmarks matched. The same bent signpost, the same huge boulder on the side. My car was gone. Panic hit me full force. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to figure out what to do. There was no cell reception. The nearest village was at least 20 kilometers away, maybe more. I decided I had no choice. I started walking, sticking to the dirt road. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. I walked for hours, muscles screaming, feet blistered and sore. As the light faded, I came across a small wooden cabin set back from the road. It didn't look abandoned. Smoke curled from a thin metal chimney pipe. An old pickup truck sat in the dirt driveway. I didn't think twice. I marched up to the door and knocked hard. After a few moments, the door creaked open. An older man in a flannel shirt and worn jeans peered out at me. The air was thin in the mountains, and the drive up had been longer than I had expected. I had read somewhere that these cabins were supposed to be secluded, but I never anticipated just how isolated this place would feel. It was early October, and the trees were a mix of bright yellow and red, but the bright colors of fall only made the place feel even more distant. It was a cozy-looking cabin at first glance, sitting quietly in the middle of the woods, surrounded by tall trees that felt like they were watching me. I had come up here alone. I was supposed to meet some friends, but plans fell through. They were busy with work, and I just couldn't bring myself to cancel the trip. I needed some time to clear my head. I had been feeling stressed lately. Too many things at once, too much noise in my life. A weekend getaway was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. The moment I pulled up the gravel driveway, the peacefulness of the place hit me hard. The only sounds were the crunch of my tires on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I parked my car next to the cabin, and it looked so much like the kind of cabin I had always imagined. Wooden, a little rundown but still functional, with a small porch that looked out over the woods. The cabin had no neighbors for miles, not that I could see. There were no other lights on the horizon, and the nearest town was an hour's drive away. Perfect, I thought. I grabbed my bags and started walking up the steps to the porch. The door was old, wooden, and creaked a little when I opened it. The interior smelled like pine and dust, but it was comfortable enough. I spent the first few hours unpacking, setting up my stuff in the living room, and organizing my space. There was a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a couple of armchairs scattered around the room. The cabin had an old-fashioned charm to it, rustic, yet inviting. The wood floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored each room. Everything looked fine, nothing out of place, but there was a quietness to it that made me uneasy. Felt too quiet, like the kind of silence that only exists when no one else is around. By dusk, I decided to make a fire. I wasn't really planning to stay out for long, but I figured I could sit by the warmth of the fire for a bit, maybe have a drink, and relax. It wasn't like I had anything better to do. The fire crackled as I sat back, watching the flames dance. The shadows in the cabin grew long, stretching across the walls. The crackling wood and the occasional wind outside were the only sounds. The whole place felt like it was wrapped in a cocoon of stillness. I hadn't planned on staying out too long, but the fire was so soothing, and the cold outside was getting worse. I had closed the door and drawn the curtains earlier, hoping to keep out the chill. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to pick up. The wind howled through the trees, and I could hear branches scraping against the sides of the cabin. I made my way to the kitchen to grab a snack, but as I opened the fridge, I felt a strange sensation. There was something off. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, like I was being watched. I couldn't pinpoint why. It was a stupid feeling, but it was there, and it didn't go away. I glanced over my shoulder. The house was dark except for the glow of the fire. No movement. Nothing. I shrugged it off and grabbed a granola bar. I needed to calm down. Maybe I was just tired. I sat back down on the couch and ate the granola bar, staring into the fire. The wind outside howled louder. Something about that wind, how it seemed to pick up and die down without warning, was starting to annoy me. It didn't seem natural. I told myself it was just the weather, just the storm passing through. But then I heard something, a faint knocking sound, almost like a soft thud against the door. Could have been the wind, but it was too rhythmic to be natural. I got up, walking cautiously to the door. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. I grabbed the handle and pulled the door open, only to find nothing but the empty, dark porch. The wind whipped past me, making the trees creak and groan. I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing to see. I closed the door and bolted it shut. My heart was pounding now, and my hands were cold. I thought I heard a voice in the distance. Someone calling out? No, it was just the wind. I convinced myself that it was nothing. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I tried to get some sleep, but the noise from the storm outside kept me awake. I kept hearing that knocking sound again. It was soft, almost gentle, but rhythmic and insistent. Finally, I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun was shining through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and stretch my legs. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that felt refreshing. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange feeling from last night. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone, and everything had been fine. Nothing was wrong. I kept telling myself that. But then I noticed something. There were footprints in the dirt just outside the porch. They were faint, but they were there, fresh footprints, deep in the dirt, leading from the edge of the forest and stopping right at the cabin. Whoever had been out there, they had been close. Too close. I hadn't heard anything. There was no one here. I stared at the footprints for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were from someone who had been passing by, someone from the nearest town. But that didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be around here. I looked around the property, but there was no one in sight. No signs of anyone nearby. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I went for a short walk through the woods, though I didn't get very far. I didn't want to go too deep into the forest. The whole place had an eerie feel to it now, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The footprints, the strange knocking sound, it was all too much. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted. I had tried to call my friends earlier, but there was no signal. It was just me, alone in the cabin. I locked the doors and made a meal, trying to push the weird thoughts out of my head. The night came again, and with it, the wind. It wasn't long before the knocking sound started again, louder this time. It was coming from the back of the cabin, just outside the window. My heart started to race. The wind howled, and the trees creaked in the distance, but that knocking, it was like someone was trying to get in. I didn't know what to do. I stayed still, listening, praying it would stop, but it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours. Finally, in the dead of night, I gathered up the courage to go outside and check. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly stepped onto the porch. The air was freezing, the chill of the mountains biting at my skin. I shone the light around, scanning the area. Everything was still. The porch, the trees, the driveway. I turned around, breathing a little easier. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I turned back to the door, my flashlight caught something at the edge of the trees. A figure. It was standing there, motionless, just out of the beam's reach. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no way anyone should be out there. The figure moved, slowly. I stumbled backward, heart racing. I was about to turn and run back into the cabin when the figure stepped forward into the light. It was just a man, an old man dressed in ragged clothes. He looked lost, I couldn't tell if he was real or if I was just losing my mind. He spoke, but I didn't hear the words. My pulse raced as I quickly backed into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know who he was, but I was certain he wasn't supposed to be here. I called the sheriff the next morning, but by the time he arrived, the man was gone. No sign of him anywhere. No footprints. No traces. It was like he had vanished. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, locked inside the cabin, watching the shadows grow long and knowing that no matter how far I ran, I'd never really feel safe in that cabin again. But after all of that, the one thing I was sure of was that I was never coming back to this cabin. It wasn't just the figure or the knocks. It was the isolation, the way the mountains seemed to swallow up all the sound, and how in the end, there was nothing that could make me feel at ease. When I left, I took one last look at the cabin. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I got into my car, drove off, and never looked back. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The thought of getting away from everything, work, noise, the constant stream of notifications on my phone, was something I desperately needed. The cabin I had rented was deep in the mountains, secluded from the nearest town, with no neighbors for miles. It seemed like the perfect spot for some quiet time to clear my head. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and rustic. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place where the trees were so thick that the sun barely touched the ground in some spots. The place had a charm to it, like it had been there for decades, though it was only a few years old. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, and the faint smell of pine and earth hung in the air, making everything feel grounded, real. I had arrived late in the afternoon, and as soon as I stepped out of my car, I could feel the cool mountain air. It was refreshing, and a slight chill ran through me. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the cabin, my boots crunching the gravel beneath me. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Inside, the cabin was as simple as I had hoped. There was a stone fireplace that looked like it could heat the entire place, a small kitchen with a gas stove, a table, and a couple of chairs. The bed was unmade, just as I liked it when I first arrived, something about the idea of claiming a place as my own for the time I would be there. The view from the small window beside the bed was breathtaking, the kind of view that made you forget about everything else. The mountains stretched far in the distance, the trees rolling down into a valley that seemed to go on forever. I set my things down and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. There was no traffic, no voices, just the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. This was what I needed. I didn't plan to do much that evening. It was just a night to settle in. I set up a small fire in the fireplace, lit a candle on the table, and opened the windows to let the evening air in. As I cooked some dinner, I thought about how peaceful everything felt. It was the first time in a long while that I didn't feel rushed. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, like I wasn't truly alone. It was something subtle at first, just a sense that the cabin was watching me, almost as if the walls themselves were keeping track of my every movement. But it was easy to brush it off as nothing more than my overactive imagination. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book I had brought along. The shadows in the cabin flickered and danced, stretching long across the walls. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the trees. It wasn't a bad wind. It wasn't stormy or howling, but there was something off about it. The way the trees seemed to sway in unnatural ways, like they were bending too much for the wind's force. I tried to focus on the book, but the words kept blurring in front of me. My thoughts drifted, and I found myself staring at the fire, letting the warmth from the flames fill me as I tried to ignore the creeping discomfort. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, barely noticeable at first, almost like a branch brushing against the cabin. But the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It was coming from the side of the cabin, near the back. I stood up, unsure of what to make of it. I went to the window that faced the woods, but I couldn't see anything through the dark. It was the kind of darkness where even the stars seemed too far away. I peered out for a while, watching for any movement, any signs of something, anything, just out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. I shook my head, muttering to myself that I was probably just tired. The day had been long, and the quiet of the cabin was beginning to feel too heavy. I went back to the fire and tried to shake the feeling off. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The tapping continued intermittently, like the branches were still tapping against the cabin's walls. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At one point, I thought I heard something scratching at the windows, but when I checked, there was nothing there. It was getting to the point where every small sound felt amplified, like the entire cabin had come alive around me. I woke up several times during the night, feeling restless and uneasy, but each time I convinced myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I reminded myself that there was nothing out there, nothing to worry about. The wind was simply playing tricks. By morning, I was exhausted, but the sunlight coming through the cabin windows gave me a sense of comfort. I made some coffee, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. The sun had risen high, and I could see more clearly now. The mountains were bathed in a warm light, the trees looking majestic in the soft morning glow. But as I stepped outside to take in the scenery, something caught my eye. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, like something had been walking around it during the night. The soil near the cabin's foundation had been shifted, and some of the leaves were crushed, as if something heavy had passed through. I knelt down to get a closer look, my heart beginning to race. There were tracks, footprints, large and deep, but not animal tracks. They were too wide, too uneven. They looked like boots, but not the kind I'd seen before. The toes were oddly shaped, almost as if they had been forced into the ground. The feeling that I wasn't alone in this place was now undeniable. I had to be imagining things, right? This couldn't be happening. But the tracks were right there in front of me, clear as day. I backed away, my thoughts swirling. I needed to think. I should call someone, tell them about the strange sounds, the strange tracks, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I came here to get away from the noise, from the distractions, and now I was becoming part of the noise I was trying to escape. I decided to spend the day hiking, hoping that some fresh air and exercise would clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and headed toward the trail I had seen when I arrived. The trail was narrow, winding its way through thick trees, climbing higher and higher into the mountains. As I walked, I tried to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind, focusing on the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt path. Hours passed, and the deeper into the woods I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no one around for miles, and the further I walked, the more it felt like I was walking into another world. It was beautiful, but it was also eerily quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then I heard something else. A faint sound, not from the woods, but from somewhere up ahead on the trail. It was almost like a low hum, like something was vibrating in the air. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was distant, but it was unmistakable. I continued on, the noise growing louder with every step. It was a strange, unsettling sound, like something was just out of sight, hidden from view. I couldn't make out what it was, but it felt wrong, unnatural. As I approached a clearing in the woods, the noise stopped abruptly. I froze, and then I saw it. A figure standing just off the path, hidden partially behind a large tree. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its clothes were tattered, like they had been worn for years. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze, as if it were staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a slow step back, my heart racing. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the shadows of the trees. I blinked, unsure if I had seen it at all, but the fear that gripped me was real. I didn't wait to find out. I turned around and ran. My heart was pounding in my chest as I raced back down the trail, desperate to get back to the cabin. When I finally made it back, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I didn't know what I had seen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, coming from all sides of the cabin, as if something or someone was circling it. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the outside from the window. There was nothing, but the unease in my chest was unbearable. The next morning, I left. I didn't care about the money I'd paid for the cabin. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there. As I drove away, the mountain road stretching before me, I looked back in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, isolated and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I left. I never went back to that cabin. And though I still don't know what I encountered that night, I know one thing for sure. Sometimes, the silence of the woods can hide things better left unseen. I had always been the kind of person who loved the outdoors, who thrived in the quiet isolation of nature. So when my friend Matt invited me to spend a weekend at a secluded cabin in the mountains, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Matt had been planning this trip for months, and the cabin was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Tucked away in a dense forest, far from any civilization, it was meant to be a peaceful retreat from the daily grind. We had heard rumors about the area, of course. People always talked about weird occurrences in places like that. Strange sounds at night, animals acting out of the ordinary, and sometimes even people disappearing. But I'd never been one to buy into those stories. It all sounded like typical campfire tales to me. Matt wasn't too concerned either. He'd been up there before and assured me it was the perfect spot to get away from everything. The drive to the cabin was long. It took us almost 6 hours to get from the city to the remote part of the woods where Matt had rented the cabin. As we neared our destination, the road turned to dirt, and the trees became denser, casting long, ominous shadows. Matt kept the music off, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, probably thinking about the weekend ahead. I couldn't blame him. The idea of a few days with no phones, no work, and no distractions was a welcome relief. When we arrived, the cabin looked exactly like I had imagined: rustic, weathered wood, a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and a chimney that puffed smoke into the crisp air. It was quaint, peaceful, and felt like it belonged in a movie. I couldn't wait to get inside, drop my bags, and unwind. We unloaded the car and went inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a large stone fireplace, a couple of mismatched sofas, and a wooden dining table in the corner. There were windows on every wall, providing a view of the surrounding forest. It was a beautiful setting, even though the clouds were gathering, and a chill hung in the air. "Do you want to go for a hike before it gets dark?" Matt asked, already changing into his hiking boots. "Sure, why not?" I replied, eager to explore the woods. The trail started right behind the cabin, winding through thick trees and steep terrain. The sounds of the forest surrounded us: birds chirping, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying eeriness about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt different than other forests I'd been in. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. We hiked for about an hour before we came to a clearing. The sky was growing darker, and the wind had picked up, causing the trees to sway. It wasn't cold yet, but the dampness in the air was starting to get to me. Matt stopped to catch his breath, and I looked around. That's when I noticed something strange in the distance, something I couldn't quite make out. It was a silhouette standing between two trees. It looked like a figure, but it was too far to tell for sure. I squinted, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me, especially with the dimming light and the wind making everything look blurry. "Let's head back," I suggested, feeling uneasy for no reason at all. Matt agreed, and we turned back toward the cabin. The hike back seemed longer somehow, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could hear footsteps behind us, but when I turned around, no one was there. I dismissed it as my mind playing games. As we reached the cabin, the wind had picked up even more, and the first raindrops started to fall. We hurried inside, and I immediately felt a sense of relief as I closed the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. We spent the evening cooking, playing cards, and talking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The sounds outside were louder now, the wind howling, branches scraping against the windows. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the unease lingered. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I lay there, listening, hoping I was just imagining it, but the footsteps were clear and deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin. I didn't say anything to Matt. He was a heavy sleeper, and I didn't want to wake him unless I was sure something was wrong. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the wind, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart. The next day, Matt and I decided to spend the morning inside, avoiding the rain. I tried to act normal, but the feeling of being watched was still there. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone, or something, standing in the distance, but there was never anything. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and we decided to head out for another hike, hoping to clear our minds. The trail was a little slippery now, but we pushed on, the ground soft beneath our boots. We walked for hours, getting deeper into the woods, until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. It was falling apart, its roof caved in, the windows shattered. "That's creepy," Matt remarked, peering through the broken window. "I don't like the look of this place," I replied, suddenly feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. We decided not to go inside, but as we turned to leave, I saw something strange. A trail of fresh footprints in the mud leading toward the old cabin. They were too big to be either of ours. "Do you think someone else is out here?" Matt asked, his voice tense. "I don't know, but I don't like it," I said, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. We hurried back to the cabin, but as we approached, we noticed something even stranger. The door was slightly ajar. We were sure we had locked it before we left. Matt hesitated, then slowly pushed the door open. The cabin was exactly how we had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped inside. Something felt wrong, like we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, seemed louder than usual. I kept hearing footsteps outside, and the fear that had been building in me all day finally broke through. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. We were truly alone, in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, Matt and I decided to leave early. We packed up quickly, eager to get away from whatever was lurking in the woods. As we drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about what had happened at the cabin, but the memory stayed with me. There were no answers, no closure, just the unsettling feeling that something had been watching us, waiting for us to leave. And in the back of my mind, I still wondered about the footprints, the strange figure in the woods, and the feeling of being followed. It's been months since that trip, and I still haven't been back to the cabin. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm sure of one thing. I won't be making that mistake again. It was a late autumn afternoon when I pulled up to the cabin in the woods, feeling the kind of excitement that only a solo trip to a remote location can give you. I had rented this cabin online, a little place nestled in the Vermont wilderness, about 2 hours away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Just me, the trees, and a whole weekend to disconnect from the grind of daily life. The cabin was small, rustic, and looked like something straight out of a postcard, surrounded by tall pine trees and tucked away off a barely visible dirt road. The kind of place where you could imagine the world standing still, where the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. I parked my truck, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the creaky porch steps. The air had that crisp, chilly bite to it that reminded me of the coming winter. I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the door open. When it finally creaked open, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was exactly what I needed: quiet, remote, simple. Inside, there was an old wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchen with mismatched cabinets, and a couple of worn-out couches. The place smelled of pine wood and a hint of damp earth, like it hadn't been used in a while, which was perfect. the kind of smell you only get from cabins left to the mercy of the elements. I couldn't wait to light the stove and curl up with a book by the fire. As I unpacked, the evening sun began to dip behind the trees, and the once vibrant forest started to take on a darker tone. I could hear the wind picking up outside, sending waves of dry leaves rustling across the ground. The kind of sound that made everything feel more isolated, more quiet. I started the fire in the stove, the crackling of the wood a comforting sound as I settled in on the couch. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the snap of burning wood. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness outside thickening as the shadows grew longer. But I didn't mind. I liked it. The peace, the solitude. I had a few beers, cooked up some stew in the small pot on the stove, and then spent the evening reading, letting the fire warm the cabin against the growing cold. There was something about being in a place so remote that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Everything felt real, grounded, like I was reconnecting with something primal. Around 10 p.m., I began to feel the weight of the day's drive settling in, and I figured it was time to turn in. I doused the fire, left the glow of the embers to gently light the room, and climbed into the bed in the small, simple bedroom. The bed creaked under my weight, but it felt cozy enough. I pulled the heavy quilt up around me, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, the shadows of the night dancing across them. But sleep didn't come easy. The wind outside started howling, rattling the windows. It was nothing unusual, just a storm probably. But the wind, that constant noise, started to feel different. There was something unsettling about it, something rhythmic, almost deliberate. It made me uneasy, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I shook it off, thinking it was just nerves from being alone in the woods, and tried to relax. But the noise grew louder. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It sounded like thumping, like something heavy was hitting the cabin, but there was no reason for it. The walls didn't shake, but the sound was unmistakable. I held my breath, listening, but when I didn't hear it again, I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch, or maybe the old wood settling. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the room, listening for anything that might confirm or deny my suspicions. But nothing came. No more thumps, no more strange sounds. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke up the next morning to the bright light of the sun streaming through the windows. The storm had passed, and the air outside had that crisp, fresh feel to it. Birds were chirping, the leaves were rustling, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Just a strange night, I thought. Nothing to worry about. After breakfast, I decided to go for a hike. The woods around the cabin were dense with trees, and the thought of spending the day outdoors seemed like the perfect way to reset. I grabbed my pack, threw on my boots, and headed out into the forest. The path was a little overgrown, but it wasn't hard to follow. I walked for hours, lost in the beauty of it all. The towering trees, the soft earth beneath my feet, the smell of pine and wet leaves. It felt like I was the only person on earth. Around midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. I sat down on a rock, pulled out my water, and took in the surroundings. The sun was shining through the branches, casting dappled light across the ground. It was peaceful. But then, I noticed something strange. Just off to the side, near the edge of the clearing, there was a pile of rocks, unnatural, like they had been stacked deliberately. I stood up to get a closer look. The rocks weren't very big, just enough to make a small, odd-looking mound. Something about it made me feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just a random rock pile, maybe left by someone else who had been there before. I continued my walk after a few minutes, but the strange feeling lingered in the back of my mind. When I returned to the cabin later that afternoon, the quiet had taken on a new edge. It felt heavier somehow, like the air itself had thickened. As the night fell, I tried to shake off the unease I was feeling. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees and making the cabin creak. But this time, there was no denying it. The thumping noise had returned. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, heavy thuds, spaced out and distant. I stood by the window, looking out into the dark forest, trying to figure out where it was coming from. But there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house seemed to be closing in on me, the walls too tight, the air too thick. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the locks on all the doors, and made sure the windows were secure. But it wasn't just the cabin that was unsettling me. It was the woods. The way they seemed to close in around the cabin, the way they whispered in the wind, as if they were hiding something. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the thumps, closer now, and it was all I could do not to open the door and run out into the dark woods to confront whatever it was. But the cabin was too quiet, too still. The fire had died down, leaving only faint embers to cast shadows on the walls. I kept my flashlight beside me, its beam cutting through the dark, reassuring me in a way. And then, at some point, the noise stopped. Completely. For hours, there was nothing but silence. It was eerie, almost suffocating. I tried to force myself to relax, but it felt like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, tossed everything into my bag, and decided to leave. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was making those sounds. My nerves were shot. As I stepped outside, the woods seemed darker than before, the shadows stretching long and deep. I made my way back to my truck, heart pounding in my chest. But as I looked back at the cabin, something caught my eye. The same pile of rocks from earlier, the one I had dismissed as insignificant, was now much larger. The rocks were stacked higher, arranged in a pattern I hadn't seen before. I didn't need to look any longer. I hopped into my truck and drove away, leaving the cabin and the woods behind. I didn't know what had been going on there, but I didn't care to find out. Whatever was in those woods wasn't something I was willing to face alone. I don't know what happened at that cabin, and part of me doesn't want to know. Maybe it was just the wind, or the isolation, or maybe I was just letting my imagination run wild. But I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. It was late in the fall when I decided to take some time off from everything. Work, responsibilities, all the usual noise. I had been feeling stressed for weeks, and I just needed to get away. Somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated. That's when I came across a small cabin on a remote stretch of land near the woods. The photos online looked serene. A rustic wooden cabin surrounded by trees, a small creek running nearby, and a view that seemed to go on forever. It was everything I needed: peace, solitude, and a break from the hustle and bustle of life. I booked the cabin for a week, paid up front, and started packing. My goal was simple: leave my phone off, spend time in nature, and focus on myself for a while. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going, just told a few friends that I was taking a break. The drive to the cabin was long. The road started to narrow as I got deeper into the mountains. It wasn't exactly a well-paved highway, and the last stretch was nothing more than a gravel path winding through thick forest. There was no one around, just trees and the occasional squirrel darting across the road. As I drove, I kept thinking to myself how perfect this would be. Away from the distractions of city life, no one to bother me, and nothing but the sound of birds and the wind. When I finally reached the cabin, I was a little surprised at how isolated it felt. It was surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbor, if you could even call them that, was miles away. The cabin itself was small but well kept, with a stone chimney and a few window boxes full of colorful flowers that had clearly been planted with care. The front porch had a few old rocking chairs, and there was an old wooden sign nailed to a tree nearby that simply read, "Welcome to Fernwood Cabin." The owner of the cabin had left a note in the entryway, along with a few simple instructions. It all seemed straightforward: turn on the generator for power, use the woodpile for the stove, and enjoy my stay. The cabin had running water, though I was told it came from a well, and I would need to pump it by hand if I ran out. I was eager to get settled, so I unpacked my things quickly, lit a fire in the stove, and took a deep breath. The scent of burning wood filled the cabin, and the soft crackle of the flames was comforting. I was alone, peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to think about anything else. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time hiking through the forest, collecting firewood, and simply enjoying the quiet. The weather had been unpredictable, with occasional rainstorms rolling through, but the cabin had been warm and dry. I found a few old trails near the cabin, leading deeper into the woods, and one morning, I decided to venture farther than I had before. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me, blocking out much of the sky. The only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. I found an old, overgrown trail which I followed for a while. It seemed to lead nowhere, but I was curious. It was as though the forest was hiding something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After a couple of hours, I turned back, feeling slightly uneasy. I couldn't quite explain why. The quiet had started to feel oppressive. As I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing something, a snap of a twig here, the rustling of leaves there, but every time I stopped and looked, there was nothing, just trees, nothing out of the ordinary. The evening came, and I settled in for a quiet night in front of the fire. As I ate a simple dinner, I kept glancing toward the windows. It was dark outside, and I could see only the reflection of the flames dancing across the glass. But there was something else. In the reflection, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting past, too quick for me to catch, and yet it felt real. I tried to convince myself it was just the flickering firelight, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind kept racing. Every little creak of the wood, every snap of a branch outside, seemed to amplify in the silence of the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I checked, the place was empty. There was nothing. Still, I couldn't relax. The next day, I tried to shake off the anxiety and decided to go for another hike, thinking that some fresh air would clear my head. I walked further along the trail I had discovered, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that someone or something was nearby. It wasn't just the sound of the forest anymore. There was a presence. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. I couldn't explain it. I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a small pond. The water was still, the surface reflecting the sky perfectly. It was peaceful. I sat down by the water's edge, trying to ground myself. That's when I noticed something strange. At the edge of the clearing, near a thicket of brush, there was a pile of rocks, arranged in a peculiar way. Not just a random pile, but deliberately stacked. It wasn't something natural. The more I looked at it, the more I felt uneasy. It was too perfect, too intentional, almost as if someone had left it there for a reason. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked over to the rocks. As I got closer, I noticed something odd beneath the pile. Pieces of old, weathered fabric. It looked like remnants of clothing, but it was too deteriorated to make out any details. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be. I backed away slowly, trying not to panic. It was probably nothing, just some old debris left by previous hikers or hunters. But deep down, I knew that I didn't want to stay there any longer. I quickly turned around and made my way back to the cabin, not daring to look over my shoulder. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, more out of instinct than anything else. I couldn't explain it, but I had the feeling that someone was out there, watching. Every little noise made me jump. Every gust of wind that rattled the trees felt like an intrusion. I barely slept. The next morning, I was exhausted, but I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly and was ready to go. The forest was still and quiet when I stepped outside, but the air felt charged, like a storm was coming. I drove away without looking back, determined not to think about the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. As I left the gravel road behind and merged back onto the main highway, the tension in my chest finally began to loosen. I drove for hours, the landscape changing as I left the forest behind. It wasn't until I got back to civilization back to the noise and chaos of the city, that I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I still don't know what exactly happened out there. Whether it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or whether there was something truly strange about that place, I'll never know. But I do know one thing. Sometimes, when you step into the woods, you're not just alone with nature. There are things out there that we don't understand. And sometimes, it's better to walk away and never look back. I had been working nonstop for weeks, barely catching any breaks. So, when I finally got the opportunity to take some time off, I jumped at the chance. I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. I was 28, living in a small town in upstate New York, and I had never done anything like this before. Being alone in nature in a place far away from civilization. It sounded perfect for clearing my mind. The cabin was located in the Adirondacks, miles away from any town, surrounded by dense forest. When I arrived, I was immediately struck by how peaceful it was. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost overwhelming after the constant noise of the city. The owner had left the key under a rock near the front door, so I let myself in. The cabin was small, a simple one-bedroom with a stone fireplace and wooden beams lining the ceiling. The walls were adorned with rustic decorations, giving it an authentic, homely feel. I set my bag down and took in the surroundings, looking out the large windows that overlooked a small lake in the distance. The place was exactly as advertised, isolated and cozy. There was even a small dock extending into the lake, perfect for sitting and watching the water. I could already tell this was going to be the perfect escape. The first few hours went by quietly. I spent some time exploring the cabin and walking around the property. The land surrounding the cabin was vast, covered in dense trees with narrow, winding trails leading deeper into the woods. The weather was perfect, a cool breeze and the sun shining through the canopy of leaves above. I took my time walking around, feeling the stress of my everyday life slowly melt away. As night began to fall, I made a small fire in the fireplace and sat down with a book. The wind outside picked up a bit, rustling the leaves and making the cabin creak. There was something comforting about the sound of the wind and the crackling fire, but it also added a sense of unease. I tried to shake it off as I read, but my eyes kept wandering to the window. It was almost as if something in the darkness was watching me. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I blew out the candles and settled into bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I quickly found myself drifting off. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise, a faint thud from outside. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear over the wind and the crackling of the fire. The sound was soft, almost like something heavy had dropped onto the ground. I listened for a moment, but everything was still. I chalked it up to the wind or an animal and went back to bed. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the window. The noise from the night before seemed like a distant memory. I got dressed and made some coffee, stepping outside onto the porch to enjoy the morning. The world felt so calm and untouched, like I was the only person left in existence. After breakfast, I decided to explore the trails around the cabin more thoroughly. I grabbed my water bottle and headed out, following a trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches interwoven to form a natural canopy. I walked for what felt like hours, enjoying the solitude and quiet. Every now and then, I would hear an animal in the distance or a rustling in the underbrush, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. As I walked further, I noticed something strange. A small clearing that wasn't on the map the owner had given me. It wasn't large, but it was big enough to feel isolated. In the center of the clearing was an old, weather-beaten shack. The wood was rotting, and the door was hanging off its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I felt a sudden unease creep over me. The shack didn't look like it belonged here. It looked abandoned, out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. Despite my growing sense of discomfort, curiosity got the better of me. I approached the shack slowly, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Creaked loudly, making me flinch. Inside, it was dark, and the air smelled musty. The floor was covered in dust and old debris. I stepped inside, trying to peer into the shadows, but all I could see were broken pieces of wood, old bottles, and other random junk scattered about. Something about the place felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or the way the air seemed thicker inside, but I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I quickly turned to leave, but as I did, I caught sight of something strange on the far wall. Scratches, deep and jagged, running across the wood. My heart skipped a beat. It didn't look like something that happened by accident. It looked deliberate. I rushed out of the shack, my breath quickening. The feeling of unease only grew stronger as I walked back toward the cabin. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, like something was following me. But when I looked over my shoulder, all I saw were trees. The whole experience left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. Back at the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm myself. I couldn't stop thinking about the shack and the scratches on the wall. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I had a nagging feeling that I wasn't the first person to have been in that shack. As the sun began to set, I decided to light the fire again and settle in for the night. The wind had picked up once more, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. I kept the lights low, trying to drown out the noise outside. But then, just as I was getting comfortable, I heard it again, the thud. It was louder this time, closer, and it made my blood run cold. I grabbed the flashlight and hurried outside, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I swept it across the area, but there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But then, I heard something else, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart raced as I looked around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. I turned and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat down on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. There was no way I was imagining this. Someone or something was out there. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. Hours passed, and I stayed in the cabin, too terrified to go back outside. The footsteps never returned, but the feeling of being watched never left. I kept hearing the creaks of the cabin, the wind pushing against the walls, but every time I tried to sleep, I would hear that faint thud, followed by the footsteps. It was like someone was circling the cabin, waiting for the right moment to come closer. I eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, but it was a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of the shack, of the footsteps, of the strange, jagged scratches on the wall. When I woke up, it was still dark, and the cabin was eerily quiet. I didn't hear anything from outside. Slowly, I got up and peeked out of the window. What I saw made my heart stop. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline clearly against the dark forest. The figure was tall and it wasn't moving. I stared at it, my chest tight with fear, unsure if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the woods, vanishing without a trace. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed my things, packed up, and left the cabin as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the money I'd spent or the days I'd planned to stay. I just needed to get out. When I arrived back in town, I went straight to the local diner and sat down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The waitress, a kind older woman, noticed my state and asked if everything was okay. I told her about the cabin, about the shack, about the figure I saw. She looked at me with wide eyes and told me that the cabin I had rented had a history. Apparently, years ago, it had been owned by a hermit who had disappeared under strange circumstances. No one had ever found out what happened to him, but some people in town said he had been not quite right. After hearing that, I didn't need any more convincing. I was just glad to be back among people. Whatever had been in those woods, whatever I had disturbed in that old shack, I never wanted to find out. I remember it like it was yesterday, although it was a few years ago now. I had just turned 32 and was feeling a bit overwhelmed by life. The constant grind of work, the noise of the city, the people around me, it was all starting to wear me down. My friends suggested I take a break, get away from everything and recharge. So, I decided to rent a small cabin in the mountains for a weekend. The place was located in a remote area, somewhere in the woods of northern Vermont. It was meant to be quiet, peaceful, and away from the chaos of the world. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive was long, and the last few miles were down a narrow, winding dirt road. There was no one else around, just trees on either side of me, tall and dense. Felt like I had left the world behind. The cabin itself looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine when you think of a secluded getaway. Small, rustic, with a porch that overlooked a steep drop into a thick forest. The sun was setting when I pulled up, and the air had that cool, crisp feeling of early autumn. I grabbed my bag, stepped out of the car, and looked around. The forest around me was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The cabin wasn't exactly luxurious, but it had everything I needed. A wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, a comfortable bed, and a big window that let in a lot of natural light. I unpacked my things, settled in, and went outside to take in the view. The forest stretched out before me, and the sky above was streaked with the colors of the setting sun. I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and some vegetables. As I sat by the stove, I began to relax. I hadn't realized how much tension I had been carrying. There was something about the solitude that made everything feel a little clearer. After dinner, I decided to go for a short walk around the property. It wasn't far, just a little trail that looped around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and set out, the beam of light cutting through the darkening woods. The path was uneven and overgrown in some places, but it wasn't hard to follow. As I walked, I thought about the last few months of my life, the stress, the pressure, the constant need to keep up. This cabin felt like the perfect escape. But then, as I walked deeper into the woods, I started to feel something. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I shook it off. It was just the isolation getting to me, I thought. The stillness of the forest, the quiet, the way everything seemed to hold its breath. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, creeping under my skin. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the cabin. But as I turned around to head back, something caught my eye. A shadow, flickering just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It wasn't much, just a glimpse, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. I stared at the spot where I'd seen the shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, just trees and darkness. I started to walk again, my steps faster now. But then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, not mine, crunching through the leaves behind me. I stopped again, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped as well. For a moment, there was nothing, absolute silence. I turned, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam bounced off tree trunks, the underbrush, but there was no one there. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked back to the cabin quickly, practically running, and slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my breath coming in short bursts. For the rest of the night, I stayed inside. I didn't sleep much. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked and groaned. But every sound seemed amplified. Every movement in the dark seemed ominous. The next morning, I woke up with the sun, feeling exhausted. I told myself that everything from the night before was just my imagination. There was nothing out there, nothing to be afraid of. I spent the day in the cabin, reading, cooking, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something strange. There were footprints outside the window, fresh ones. They led right up to the cabin door. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just an animal or someone passing by. But then I remembered no one else was supposed to be out here. The cabin was far off the main road. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The footprints were large, far too big to be from an animal. And they weren't just random. They were deliberate, leading directly to the door, then disappearing back into the woods. My heart skipped a beat. I felt a surge of panic, but I tried to calm myself down. It was probably just someone from the nearby property, I thought. Maybe a hunter or a hiker. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to leave the cabin for the rest of the day. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my keys and locked up, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. I took a drive, hoping that the winding roads and the long stretches of empty forest would calm my nerves. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I came back to the cabin in the late afternoon, feeling drained. I knew I was just being paranoid, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave me. I didn't even bother to check the footprints again. That night, I locked every window and door before going to bed. But even then, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind outside seemed to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a restless night. I kept waking up, looking out the window, and listening to the sounds of the night. I finally fell into a fitful sleep just before dawn. When I woke up, it was already light outside. I felt exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things quickly, didn't bother with breakfast, and locked the cabin behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin, standing alone in the forest. It looked so peaceful, so still, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back. Something about it just didn't feel right. I've never told anyone about that weekend. Not the footprints, not the strange feeling of being watched. And I'm not sure why. Maybe I don't want to sound crazy. Maybe I don't want to relive it. But every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, or when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear those footsteps behind me, and I wonder if I was really alone that weekend after all. But I do know one thing for sure. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. It was late October, the kind of autumn day where the air was crisp, and the trees in the mountains were starting to shed their leaves. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My friend Mark and I had decided to get away from the chaos of city life, leave behind the endless noise of traffic and the never-ending glow of streetlights. We were heading to a remote cabin in the mountains of Vermont, far from any distractions. I remember the drive up the winding roads, the trees thick with orange and yellow leaves, the hills growing steeper with each mile. Mark had rented the cabin online after doing some research, claiming it was the perfect spot for a weekend of peace and quiet. Neither of us had ever been to this part of Vermont, but it sounded like the ideal place to disconnect. It was supposed to be cozy, secluded, and perfect for a few days of hiking and catching up. We arrived as the sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. A small, wooden building with a wide front porch, a stone chimney, and a single large window that overlooked the valley below. There was a fire pit in front of the cabin and a small path leading into the woods. We unloaded our gear and set up inside. The cabin had a rustic charm to it: old wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a few mismatched furniture pieces that somehow fit perfectly. The air smelled of wood and earth, the kind of scent you get when you're deep in the forest. The windows were large, offering a stunning view of the mountain range. It felt peaceful, like we were the only ones left in the world. That evening, we spent time by the fire, the crackling sound of the burning with the only noise around us. We ate some food we had packed and cracked open a couple of beers. The cold mountain air was sharp, but it felt good to be out here, away from the chaos of everyday life. By the time we decided to turn in, the sky had turned dark, the only light coming from the glow of the fire. The cabin felt warm, and the bed I was sleeping in was surprisingly comfortable. Mark had taken the room next door, and we both quickly fell asleep, lulled by the sound of the wind howling through the trees outside. It was the kind of weekend I had been craving for months. A break from the city, from the noise, the chaos, and the never-ending cycle of work. I had taken the time off, packed up my gear, and drove out to a remote cabin in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, old cabin tucked away somewhere in the Adirondack Mountains. The kind of place you could lose yourself for a few days and forget about everything else. A friend had recommended it to me, claiming it was perfect for getting away from it all. I'm someone who loves solitude, and when I arrived, I was immediately struck by the quiet. No city sounds, no distractions, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds. The cabin itself was a modest, weathered wooden structure with a small porch and a few windows that overlooked a clearing. It had an old-world charm to it, though the woods seemed dark with age, and the door creaked ominously when I opened it. I settled in, unpacking my things, putting on a pot of coffee, and then stepping out onto the porch to survey my surroundings. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the forest, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It was exactly what I needed. But then, as I stood there, taking it all in, I noticed something strange, something out of place. There was movement, just a flicker at the edge of the woods. It was too far for me to make out clearly, but I saw something or someone shifting through the trees. My first thought was that it was probably a deer or some other animal, but then the movement stopped, and the trees around that spot seemed to rustle unnaturally. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt very exposed, standing there on the porch. I tried to shake it off. I had always been a bit jumpy in unfamiliar places, but as the night drew on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I didn't want to let my mind run wild with ideas. I had come here to relax, not to let my imagination get the best of me. But I kept checking the woods, looking out over the clearing, as if expecting someone to step out from between the trees. It was well past dark by the time I finally decided to go inside. I locked the door behind me, though I had no idea why. It was just a habit. The cabin seemed peaceful enough, yet my unease was growing. I made myself some dinner, a simple stew I had brought with me, and tried to focus on relaxing, maybe reading a book or listening to music. Anything to distract me, but the silence outside the cabin seemed deafening. Every now and then, I would hear a snap of a twig or the distant rustle of leaves. Small things, but enough to keep me on edge. Every time I went to the window to check, I saw nothing. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. I tried to ignore it, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay awake in the bed, listening to the sounds of the night, the creak of the old wood, the occasional howling of a distant coyote, and the occasional snap of something in the woods. I kept thinking I heard footsteps just outside the cabin, but whenever I'd jump out of bed and peek out the window, there was nothing. By the time the morning light crept through the trees, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, and I needed to get outside, get moving, and maybe even take a walk to clear my head. So, after making a quick breakfast, I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. The forest was still quiet, almost too quiet. The sun was just beginning to filter through the canopy of trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. I decided to explore the area around the cabin, making my way through the dense woods. The ground was soft beneath my boots, with leaves and branches littering the path. It was a beautiful, peaceful walk, but my mind kept returning to the unsettling feeling I had experienced the night before. I came across a small stream that ran through the forest. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth rocks. I knelt down to take a drink, feeling the coolness of the water as it ran over my hands. I stood there for a while, listening to the sound of the stream, trying to ground myself in the present moment. That's when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There were footprints, large, heavy prints, leading away from the stream, deeper into the woods. They were too big to be from a deer or any other animal I could think of. They looked like human footprints, but they weren't mine. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up once again. The tracks were fresh, too, only a few hours old, if that. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the footprints, trying to stay quiet, to make as little noise as possible. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees growing thicker, the air heavier. It felt as though I was walking deeper into a place I shouldn't be. But I had to know who or what had left these prints. The tracks led me to a small clearing, one I hadn't noticed before. The ground was softer here, the grass lush and green, and in the middle of the clearing, there was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of broken branches and twigs, as if someone had hastily built a shelter or a blind. I froze. The air felt thick with tension. For a moment, I thought I heard something. A crackling of leaves, the rustle of clothing, the unmistakable sound of someone moving quietly through the woods. I spun around, but there was no one there. The clearing was empty. My mind raced. Could it have been another camper? Maybe someone else who had set up in the woods? But the tracks didn't seem like they belonged to a hiker. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I stepped back slowly, my instincts telling me to leave, to get back to the cabin and lock myself inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flash of movement at the edge of the trees. I looked up quickly, but again, there was nothing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I turned on my heel and headed back toward the cabin, my pace quickening. Every snap of a twig, every rustling of the leaves seemed to echo in my ears, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt alive, as if something was moving just out of sight, trailing me. By the time I reached the cabin, I was breathless. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it immediately. I leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. My hands were shaking as I tried to steady myself. What had I just experienced? Who was out there? I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I call someone? My mind was racing, but the one thing I knew for sure was that I was no longer alone. Something or someone was in the woods with me. I'd always wanted to get away from the chaos of city life, to be alone, in nature, with nothing but the trees, the mountains, and the silence. So, when the opportunity came up to rent a small cabin in the Appalachian foothills, I jumped on it. I figured it would be the perfect place to unwind, reflect, and enjoy some peace and quiet. Little did I know that the cabin would become a source of unease, and that I would leave with far more than I ever expected. I arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. I was 28 years old, and this trip was supposed to be a solo retreat. I'd packed light, just some clothes, my camera, a few books, and some food. It was my chance to disconnect and recharge. The cabin was located off a narrow dirt road, about 20 miles from the nearest town. Perfect getaway, I thought. The place itself wasn't much to look at, but that was what I liked about it. It was small and modest, with a slanted roof and weathered wood that had probably been there for decades. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it, but the door opened easily. Inside, the space was simple: a small living room, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a loft that served as the bedroom. It smelled of wood and dust, with a hint of something old but comforting. The windows were large, offering a view of the surrounding woods. The whole atmosphere was exactly what I needed: a retreat from everything. The first day was perfect. I spent the afternoon hiking along a nearby trail, taking pictures of the autumn leaves and the distant mountains. By evening, I had a fire going in the wood stove and sat in front of it, reading a book by the glow of the flames. There was something incredibly soothing about being in the cabin, away from the noise of the outside world. I felt content, relaxed, and alone in a way that felt liberating. As the sun set, I went outside to take one last look at the stars. The night sky was pitch black, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, but there was a slight chill in the air that made me shiver. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, then settled in for the night. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up, but it didn't bother me. I had come here for the solitude, and I was embracing it. But by the second night, things started to feel off. First, it was small things. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling like something was watching me. I looked around the room, but there was nothing. The door was still locked and the windows were shut. I dismissed it as just my imagination. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't anything unusual. The next day, I decided to stay inside and work on my photography portfolio. I didn't want to go hiking again, not yet. There was a certain unease that lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in the woods. Every time I went outside, I felt as though someone or something was watching me from the trees. I chalked it up to the isolation, the strange feeling you get when you're alone in a place far removed from civilization. Later that afternoon, while I was sitting by the window, I noticed something odd. A small pile of rocks had been stacked near the base of a tree just outside the cabin. It was a simple arrangement, but it didn't belong there. I hadn't seen it when I arrived, and I was certain I would have noticed it when I went outside earlier. I told myself it was nothing, just the work of some curious animal or perhaps other hikers who had passed by. But then I saw something else. The cabin's back door, which I had locked when I came inside that morning, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I had been careful to check all the locks when I entered. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Was someone here? Did I leave it open by mistake? I got up and went to the back door, my pulse quickening with each step. When I reached it, I pulled it open fully. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no one in sight. Still, my instincts told me something wasn't right. I closed the door and locked it again, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, the strange sense of being watched only intensified. I kept hearing noises outside, twigs snapping, footsteps in the distance. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just animals moving around in the woods. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just animals. There was something else. By the third day, I was starting to question my decision to stay. The peaceful retreat I had envisioned had turned into a nightmare of paranoia and unease. I tried to keep myself busy, taking pictures of the landscape and reading, but nothing could shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat by the fire that evening, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock at the door. It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart stopped. Who would be out here? I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. I waited, holding my breath, my hand frozen on the arm of the chair. There was nothing. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, just silence. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, every small noise making me jump. I kept thinking I heard something outside, but when I looked, there was nothing. The wind, the rustling leaves, and the occasional animal were the only things I could see. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to risk being here any longer. I packed my things quickly, feeling a sense of urgency. As I grabbed my bag and made my way out the door, I noticed the pile of rocks again. This time, it was different. The rocks had been rearranged. The simple stack was now an intricate design, something far too deliberate to be the work of animals. Panic surged through me. I threw my bag into the car, my hands shaking. I didn't care about my things or the cabin anymore. I just wanted to get out. As I started the car and pulled down the dirt road, I glanced back one last time at the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I finally found a small cafe, I went inside and asked about the cabin. The owner, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, gave me a strange look. "You were up at that cabin, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded. "You're lucky you left when you did," he said, his voice low. "There's been talk around here. Strange things happen up there. People disappear sometimes. No one knows why, but I'd advise you to stay away from that place." I didn't need to hear more. I left the cafe, got in my car, and drove straight home. I've never returned to that cabin, and I don't plan to. The woods may be beautiful, but they also hold secrets I'm better off not knowing. The strange feeling I had during my time there has stayed with me. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened, But one thing is certain. The silence of that cabin was not peace. It was something far more unsettling. It was a chilly Friday morning in late October when I decided to take the trip. The air had that crispness that only autumn can bring, and the fog was still heavy over the mountain paths as I loaded up my truck with camping gear. I had been meaning to get out of the city for a while, just needed a break from everything. You know? Work, people, the noise, it was all too much. So, I rented a small cabin in the Adirondacks, far enough away to feel isolated but still close enough for a quick getaway. The drive took longer than I expected, mostly because of the winding mountain roads. It was one of those paths that made me appreciate the peace of nature, even if the narrowness of the roads and occasional steep drop-offs made me grip the wheel a little too tightly. The landscape was beautiful, though, tall pines surrounding rolling hills of orange, red, and yellow leaves. Everything about it screamed serenity, which is exactly what I needed. The cabin was hidden up a dirt road off the main path. I had a rough idea of where it was, but as I turned off the road and followed the dirt trail, I began doubting myself. I passed several other smaller, rustic cabins, but none looked like the one I was looking for. Eventually, I spotted a faded wooden sign that said, Bear Creek Cabin, 2 miles. That was it. I took a deep breath and pressed on, the gravel crunching under the tires as I continued down the path. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected. Simple, a little run down, but cozy. It had a wooden porch with rocking chairs, and the front door creaked as I stepped inside. The place had been cleaned, though, and everything was arranged neatly. A firewood pile was stacked neatly by the door, and the smell of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air. It was the perfect retreat, the kind of place where I could shut everything out and just be alone with my thoughts for a couple of days. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bags and arranging my gear. The stove was wood-burning, and it wasn't long before I had a fire going, warming up the cabin's interior. I threw some extra logs on and made myself a cup of coffee while I stood by the window, looking out over the surrounding forest. It was quiet, too quiet almost. There was no traffic, no other people, just the occasional bird call. I found it peaceful at first, but as the minutes passed, I realized how strange it felt to be this isolated. That night, after cooking a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, I sat outside on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the stars. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and I wrapped a thick woolen blanket around my shoulders. The fire pit I had built earlier still crackled away, sending occasional sparks into the cold night air. But as the night wore on, the quiet began to feel heavier. It wasn't the usual peaceful stillness of a secluded place. It was more like an absence of sound, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me. Around midnight, I went inside to get some rest. The cabin had one bedroom with a big, comfortable bed. I lay there for a while, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, small, muffled sounds that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe animals moving outside. But the more I listened, the more I realized these sounds were different. They were deliberate, like something was walking around outside, just beyond my view. I tried to convince myself that it was just a deer or a raccoon, but the noise grew louder, closer. The steps seemed to circle the cabin, first on one side, then the other, always just outside of my line of sight. My mind raced as I lay in the dark, straining to listen. The silence between each step stretched out longer than it should have, making the whole thing feel unnatural. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the bed and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. I shone the light across the porch and the area surrounding the cabin. Nothing. The woods were empty. The only thing moving was the wind, blowing leaves and branches. Relieved, I put the flashlight down, but the unease didn't go away. I sat back on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. The feeling that I wasn't alone in that cabin wouldn't leave me. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The next morning, I decided to get some fresh air and take a walk through the woods. I grabbed my boots and a jacket and set off down a trail that I had spotted the day before. The forest was dense here, with thick underbrush and a variety of trees, but the path was well trodden. The sun filtered down through the trees in soft beams, casting long shadows on the ground. The whole place felt calm and peaceful, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more unsettled I felt. It wasn't anything I could see. It was more of an instinct. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap behind me, or the rustle of leaves as if something were following me. But each time I turned, nothing was there. I tried to push the feeling out of my mind. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. After a few hours of walking, I found a small clearing. In the center of it was an old stone well, overgrown with vines and moss. The sight of it unsettled me more than it should have. I stood there for a while, staring at the well, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I didn't want to be there anymore. I turned and hurried back down the trail, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The cabin was still miles away, and the trail felt longer on the return. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the well. Why had it unsettled me so much? Was I just imagining things? That evening, after dinner, I decided to sit by the fire outside again. I tried to relax, telling myself I was overthinking everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I heard the footsteps again that night, only this time they were unmistakable. There was no mistaking the sound of someone walking around the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, like they were waiting for me to make a move. My heart raced in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't go outside this time. I sat still, listening. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I was terrified. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing moved. The night was dead silent again, except for the crackle of the fire. It took me a while, but I finally mustered the courage to open the door. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, and I stepped out cautiously. The porch was empty. There was no sign of anyone, just the usual shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But that's when I saw it. The wooden sign by the front door had been turned around. It had been facing outward when I first arrived, but now it was facing the cabin, as if someone had deliberately moved it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was no longer alone out here, and I knew it. I packed up the next morning, despite the beautiful view, despite everything I had planned to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't meant to be there. I didn't know who or what had been messing with me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin, the woods, all of it seemed to vanish into the fog, as though it had never been there at all. But as I passed the first bend in the road, I saw something I'll never forget. Standing at the edge of the woods, watching me, was a figure. I slammed my foot on the gas and never looked back. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would want to escape into the woods for solitude. I used to think those people were just running away from life, but after a particularly rough year, I found myself yearning for peace and quiet. The constant noise of city life, the pressure of work, and the weight of constant notifications had finally broken me down. So I decided to rent a cabin, a little place tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The thought of being completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, and the occasional chirping of birds, seemed like the perfect reset. I found the cabin online. The description said it was in a secluded spot in the mountains, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The pictures looked peaceful enough. A small wooden structure, maybe a little old, but cozy, perfect. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. There were no sounds of cars, no distant hum of city life, just silence. It was almost unsettling, but I tried to push that feeling aside. After all, I had chosen this place because I wanted to escape from everything. The cabin itself was exactly like the pictures. It had a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a simple front door with peeling red paint, and a few windows that looked out into the woods. Inside, it smelled like wood and something faintly musty. The floors creaked as I walked around, and the fireplace was the focal point of the living room. I threw my bags down, made a quick meal in the small kitchen, and decided to head out for a walk. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. I didn't expect much from the area surrounding the cabin, just some trees and maybe a few trails. But as I ventured further into the woods, I started to realize something. There were no other trails, no signs of human activity. The deeper I went, the more I felt the isolation. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt suffocating. Every step I took felt like it was taking me further away from the world I knew. By the time I turned back toward the cabin, the sun was almost gone. The woods were dark now, and the sounds of birds and insects had faded, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the wind. I quickened my pace, almost as if I could outrun the unsettling feeling that had crept up on me. I made it back to the cabin just as night fell. The fireplace was already lit, and I felt some comfort in its warmth, though the crackling of the fire only added to the eerie silence outside. I spent the rest of the evening reading a book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the loneliness playing tricks on my mind. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every creak of the floorboards made me tense. Every rustle outside made my heart race. I kept thinking I heard something, maybe someone walking around outside. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing, just the darkness of the woods. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I tried to push the unease aside. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I had come here to relax after all. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the treetops. It was beautiful, peaceful even. But then I noticed something odd. The ground in front of the cabin was disturbed. Not by much, but enough to catch my attention. A few patches of dirt had been scraped away, as though someone had dragged something heavy across it. I couldn't remember seeing that last night, but the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest grew stronger. My mind raced with possibilities, but I forced myself to ignore them. It was probably just animals, I told myself. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. The further I went, the more I realized how disorienting the forest was. The trees seemed to shift around me, and I began to lose track of time. The woods didn't have a pattern, no clear path, no sense of direction. It felt like I was walking in circles, even though I knew I wasn't. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting once again. The same feeling of isolation hung in the air, but now there was something else. A sense of being watched, like eyes were boring into my back from the trees. I didn't even want to go inside, but the thought of being out in the dark woods alone was far worse. That night, I locked the door and kept the curtains closed. I turned on all the lights inside, as if that would make me feel safer. But the silence outside only seemed to grow louder. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps around the cabin, slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling the place. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the perimeter, but there was nothing. The woods were dark and empty. I went back inside, my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just waiting. I tried to sleep, but the sound of my own heartbeat was louder than the silence. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the trees. The next day, I decided to leave. I couldn't handle the tension anymore. I packed up my things, ready to get out of there. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The entire area around the cabin was different. The ground had been disturbed more than before. The dirt near the porch had been dug up, and I could see footprints in the soft earth. Large, heavy prints that seemed to circle the cabin. That's when I realized what had been bothering me all along. The place wasn't just isolated, it was intentionally isolated. Someone had been here before me. Someone had been watching me. I didn't even bother to lock the door. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and sped down the narrow dirt road, not once looking back. The drive was long, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I had just experienced. But the further I drove, the more I realized something. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town and stopped at a gas station that I found out the truth. I asked the clerk if there had ever been any incidents around the area, and she gave me a strange look. "You didn't know?" she said. "That cabin, it's been empty for years. The last people who stayed there, well, they never came back. People say there's something wrong with the place. Some say it's cursed, but I don't know about all that. Just don't go back there." I didn't need her to tell me. I knew that cabin was no place for anyone. Not anymore. It was meant to be forgotten, left alone in the woods. I never went back. The woods took something from me that weekend. Something I can't explain, but I know it's there. It's always in the back of my mind now. The feeling that there's something out there, watching, waiting for the next person to wander too far into the woods. And I never will.